You cannot start reading a book without knowing what is in it for you, right? So the book Becoming by Michelle Obama is an inspiring and deeply insightful memoir that can help the audience of your channel find a similar path towards self-improvement by drawing inspiration from the life of one of the world's most accomplished individuals. This book provides an in-depth look at Michelle Obama's life, from her childhood and youth to her role as the First Lady of the United States, highlighting the impact she both made and received along this journey. In Becoming, Obama shares the challenges she faced as a Black woman, her experiences at university and as a lawyer, and the struggles and honors she encountered as the First Lady. She shows us how she maintained hope and persevered despite social and cultural obstacles, achieving great heights through continuous effort. Reading this book offers readers much more than just a story of her life. It provides a roadmap for self-discovery and resilience. Readers can learn how to overcome personal and social challenges, find purpose, and build confidence to pursue their goals. This journey with Michelle Obama not only inspires growth, but also helps readers recognize their own potential to become the best version of themselves. So enough talking about it, and let's get into the book itself.
Becoming. When I was a kid, my dreams were simple. I wanted a dog. I wanted a house with stairs, a real 2-story home. And for reasons I can't quite explain, I wanted my family to drive a 4-door station wagon instead of my dad's beloved 2-door Buick. Back then, I'd tell people I was going to be a pediatrician just because I knew it would make adults smile and say, "Oh, that's wonderful." But now, looking back, I realize that might be one of the strangest questions we ask children. What do you want to be when you grow up? As if life is all about reaching some final destination. Because that's just it. Life keeps moving, and we keep evolving. Becoming isn't about finally arriving. It's about continuing to reach, to adapt, to become. Over the years, my path took me places I couldn't have anticipated. I became a lawyer, a vice president at a hospital, a director of a nonprofit supporting young people and shaping their careers, and then, unexpectedly, the First Lady of the United States. I've sat in rooms where I was the only Black person, the only woman, or sometimes both, navigating spaces that challenged and humbled me and, at times, lifted me beyond anything I could have imagined. I've been a sister, a bride, a daughter, a mother, and a woman figuring it all out, just like anyone else. Being First Lady was an extraordinary honor, but it wasn't an easy job. It stretched me to my limits, introduced me to inspiring people, and made me face parts of myself that I hadn't fully known. Being in the public, I was a journey all its own. America showed itself to me in its extremes. I met families who lost everything in a hurricane and were grateful just to have a working refrigerator. I met military spouses who endured unimaginable challenges and somehow found the strength to lift others. And of course, there were children, countless kids across America and the world who made me laugh, gave me hope, and taught me how resilient the human spirit can be. But it wasn't all heartwarming. I was also held up as a symbol of strength and at times torn down as an angry Black woman. I've smiled for photos with people who publicly insulted my husband, people who then wanted a picture to hang on their wall. I've laughed it off when the internet picked apart my every move, sometimes questioning if I was even a woman. But through it all, I knew who I was, thanks to the steady love and values my parents instilled in me. After 8 years in the White House, we finally stepped back. Moving out felt surreal. My family left a place with Secret Service agents at every corner, with a bowling alley in the basement and a florist down the hall. The White House was where our daughters played and where our dog occasionally left little gifts on the rug. But one winter morning, just like that, we handed the keys over to the new family. And suddenly, I was back in a house that was just ours, watching my own 2 hands make a simple piece of toast in the quiet of my kitchen. There's a lot I still don't know about life or where it's taking me. But I do know myself more deeply than ever. I know the strength and resilience that runs through me. And I know, just as my story shaped me, your story is yours to hold and own. In the end, that's what each of us has, our story and what we choose to become. Becoming Chapter 1, I spent much of my childhood listening to the sound of striving. It came in the form of bad music, or at least amateur music, coming up through the floorboards of my bedroom, the plink, plink, plink of students sitting downstairs at my great-aunt Robbie's piano, slowly and imperfectly learning their scales. My family lived in the South Shore neighborhood of Chicago, in a tidy brick bungalow that belonged to Robbie and her husband Terry. My parents rented an apartment on the 2nd floor, while Robbie and Terry lived on the first. Robbie was my mother's aunt and had been generous to her over many years, but to me she was kind of a terror. Prim and serious, she directed the choir at a local church and was also our community's resident piano teacher. She wore sensible heels and kept a pair of reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She had a sly smile but didn't appreciate sarcasm the way my mother did. I'd sometimes hear her chewing out her students for not having practiced enough or chewing out their parents for delivering them late to lessons. "Good night," she'd exclaim in the middle of the day, with the same blast of exasperation someone else might say. Oh, for God's sake! Few, it seemed, could live up to Robbie's standards. The sound of people trying, however, became the soundtrack to our life. There was plinking in the afternoons, plinking in the evenings. Ladies from church sometimes came over to practice hymns, belting their piety through our walls. Under Robbie's rules, kids who took piano lessons were allowed to work on only one song at a time. From my room, I'd listen to them attempting, note by uncertain note, to win her approval, graduating from Hot Cross Buns to Brahms's Lullaby, but only after many tries. The music was never annoying, it was just persistent. It crept up the stairwell that separated our space from Robbie's. It drifted through open windows in summertime, accompanying my thoughts as I played with my Barbies or built little kingdoms made out of blocks. The only respite came when my father got home from an early shift at the city's water treatment plant and put the Cubs game on TV, boosting the volume just enough to blot it all out. This was the tail end of the 1960s on the south side of Chicago. The Cubs weren't bad, but they weren't great either. I'd sit on my dad's lap in his recliner and listen to him narrate how the Cubs were in the middle of a late-season swoon, or why Billy Williams, who lived just around the corner from us on Constance Avenue, had such a sweet swing from the left side of the plate. Outside the ballparks, America was in the midst of a massive and uncertain shift. The Kennedys were dead. Martin Luther King Jr. had been killed standing on a balcony in Memphis, setting off riots across the country, including in Chicago. The 1968 Democratic National Convention turned bloody as police went after Memoir protesters with batons and tear gas in Grant Park, about 9 miles north of where we lived. White families, meanwhile, were moving out of the city in droves, lured by the suburbs' the promise of better schools, more space. And probably more whiteness, too. None of this really registered with me. I was just a kid, a girl with Barbies and blocks, with 2 parents and an older brother who slept each night with his head about 3 feet from mine. My family was my world, the center of everything. My mother taught me how to read early, walking me to the public library, sitting with me as I sounded out words on a page. My father went to work every day dressed in the blue uniform of a city laborer, but at night he showed us what it meant to love jazz and art. As a boy, he'd taken classes at the Art Institute of Chicago, and in high school he'd painted and sculpted. He'd been a competitive swimmer and boxer in school, too, and as an adult was a fan of every televised sport, from professional golf to the NHL. He appreciated seeing strong people excel. When my brother, Craig, got interested in basketball, my father propped coins above the doorframe in our kitchen, encouraging him to leap for them. Everything that mattered was within a 5-block radius: my grandparents and cousins, the church on the corner where we were not quite regulars at Sunday school, the gas station where my mother sometimes sent me to pick up a pack of Newports, and the liquor store, which also sold Wonder Bread, penny candy, and gallons of milk. On hot summer nights, Craig and I dozed off to the sound of cheers from the adult league softball games going on at the nearby public park, where by day we climbed on the playground jungle gym and played tag with other kids. Craig and I are not quite 2 years apart in age. He's got my father's soft eyes and optimistic spirit, my mother's implacability. The two of us have always been 8, in part thanks to an unwavering and somewhat inexplicable allegiance he seemed to feel for his baby sister right from the start. There's an early family photograph, a black and white of the 4 of us sitting on a couch, my mother smiling as she holds me on her lap, my father appearing serious and proud with Craig perched on his. We're dressed for church, or maybe a wedding. I'm about 8 months old, a pudge-faced, no-nonsense bruiser in diapers and an ironed white dress, looking ready to slide out of my mother's clutches, staring down the camera as if I might eat it. Next to me is Craig, gentlemanly in a little bow tie and suit jacket, bearing an earnest expression. He's 2 years old, and already the portrait of brotherly vigilance and responsibility, his arm extended toward mine, his fingers wrapped protectively around my fat wrist. At the time the photo was taken, we were living across the hall from my father's parents in Parkway Gardens, an affordable housing project on the south side made up of modernist apartment buildings. It had been built in the 1950s and was designed as a co-op, meant to ease a post-World War II housing shortage for Black working-class families. Later, it would deteriorate under the grind of poverty and gang violence, becoming one of the city's more dangerous places co-live. Long before this, though, when I was still a toddler, my parents, who had met as teenagers and married in their mid-20s, accepted an offer to move a few miles south to Robbie and Terry's place in a nicer neighborhood. On Euclid Avenue, we were two households living under one not very big roof. Judging from the layout, the second-floor space had probably been designed as an in-law apartment meant for one or two people. But four of us found a way ko-fi inside. My parents slept in the lone bedroom, while Craig and I shared a bigger area that I assume was intended to be the living room. Later, as we grew, my grandfather Purnell Shields, my mother's father, who was an enthusiastic if not deeply skilled carpenter, brought over some cheap wooden paneling and built a makeshift partition to divide the room into two semi-private spaces. He added a plastic accordion door to each space and created a little common play area in front where we could keep our toys and books. Jay loved my room. It was just big enough for a twin bed and a narrow desk. I kept all my stuffed animals on the bed, painstakingly tucking them around my head each night as a form of ritual comfort. On his side of the wall, Craig lived a sort of mirror existence with his own bed pushed up against the paneling, parallel to mine. The partition between us was so flimsy that we could talk as we lay in bed at night, often tossing a bald sock back and forth through the 10-inch gap between the partition and the ceiling as we did. Aunt Robbie, meanwhile, kept her part of the house like a mausoleum. The furniture swathed in protective plastic that felt cold and sticky on my bare legs when I dared sit on it. Her shelves were loaded with porcelain figurines we weren't allowed to touch. I'd let my hand hover over a set of sweet-faced glass poodles, a delicate-looking mother, and 3 tiny puppies, and then pull it back, fearing Robbie's wrath. When lessons weren't happening, the first floor was deadly silent. The television was never on, the radio never played. I'm not even sure the two of them talked much down there. Robbie's husband's full name was William Victor Terry, but for some reason we called him only by his last name. Terry was like a shadow, a distinguished-looking man who wore 3-piece suits every day of the week and pretty much never said a word. I came to think of upstairs and downstairs as two different universes, ruled over by competing sensibilities. Upstairs, we were noisy and unapologetically so. Craig and I threw balls and chased each other around the apartment. We sprayed Pledge furniture polish on the wood floor of the hallway so we could slide farther and faster in our socks, often crashing into the walls. We held brother-sister boxing matches in the kitchen, using the 2 sets of gloves my dad had given us for Christmas, along with personalized instructions on how to land a proper jab. At night, as a family, we played board games, told stories and jokes, and cranked Jackson 5 records on the stereo. When it got to be too much for Robbie down below, she'd emphatically flick the light switch in our shared stairwell, which also controlled the light bulb in our upstairs hallway, off and on, again and again, her polite-ish way of telling us to pipe down. Robbie and Terry were older. They grew up in a different era, with different concerns. They'd seen things our parents hadn't, things that Craig and I, in our raucous childishness, couldn't begin to guess. This was some version of what my mother would say if we got too wound up about the grouchiness downstairs. Even if we didn't know the context, we were instructed to remember that context existed. Everyone on Earth, they'd tell us, was carrying around an unseen history, and that alone deserved some tolerance. Robbie, I'd learned many years later, had sued Northwestern University for discrimination, having registered for a choral music workshop there in 1943 and been denied a room in the women's dorm. She was instructed to stay instead in a rooming house in Town A Place for coloreds, she was told. Terry, meanwhile, had once been a Pullman porter on one of the overnight passenger rail lines running in and out of Chicago. It was a respectable, if not well-paying profession, made up entirely of black men who kept their uniforms immaculate while also hauling luggage, serving meals, and generally tending to the needs of train passengers, including shining their shoes. Years after his retirement, Terry still lived in a state of numbed finality, impeccably dressed, remotely servile, never asserting himself in any way, at least that I would see. It was as if he'd surrendered a part of himself as a way of coping. I'd watch him mow our lawn in the high heat of summer in a pair of wing tips, suspenders, and a thin-brimmed fedora, the sleeves of his dress shirt carefully rolled up. He'd indulge himself by having exactly 1 cigarette a day and exactly 1 cocktail a month, And even then, he wouldn't loosen up the way my father and mother would after having a highball or a Schlitz, which they did a few times a month. Some part of me wanted Terry to talk, to spill whatever secrets he carried. I imagined that he had all sorts of interesting stories about cities he'd visited and how rich people on trains behaved or maybe didn't. But we wouldn't hear any of it. For some reason, he'd never tell. I was about 4 when I decided I wanted to learn piano. Craig, who was in the 1st grade, was already making trips downstairs for weekly lessons on Robbie's upright and returning relatively unscathed. I figured I was ready. I was pretty convinced I already had learned piano, in fact, through straight-up osmosis. All those hours spent listening to other kids fumbling through their songs. The music was already in my head. I just wanted to go downstairs and demonstrate to my exacting great-aunt what a gifted girl I was, how it would take no effort at all for me to become her star student. Rohi's piano sat in a small square room at the rear of the house, close to a window that overlooked the backyard. She kept a potted plant in one corner and a folding table where students could fill out music worksheets in the other. During lessons, she sat straight-spined in an upholstered high-hack armchair, tapping out the beat with one finger, her head cocked as she listened keenly for each mistake. Was I afraid of Robbie? Not exactly, but there was a scariness to her. She represented a rigid kind of authority I hadn't yet encountered elsewhere. She demanded excellence from every kid who sat on her piano bench. I saw her as someone to win over, or maybe to somehow conquer. With her, it always felt like there was something to prove. At my first lesson, my legs dangled from the piano bench, too short to reach the floor. Robbie gave me my own elementary music workbook, which I vast thrilled about, and showed me how to position my hands properly over the keys. "All right, pay attention," she said, scolding me before we'd even begun. "Find middle C. When you're little, a piano can look like it has 1,000 keys. You're staring at an expanse of black and white that stretches farther than 2 small arms can reach. Middle C, I soon learned, was the anchoring point. It was the territorial line between where the right hand and the left hand traveled, between the treble and the bass clefs. If you could lay your thumb on middle C, everything else automatically fell into place. The keys on Robbie's piano had a subtle unevenness of color and shape, places where bits of the ivory had broken off over time, leaving them looking like a set of bad teeth. Helpfully, the middle C key had a full comber missing, a wedge about the size of my fingernail, which got me centered every time. It turned out I liked the piano. Sitting at it felt natural, like something I was meant to do. My family was loaded with musicians and music lovers, especially on my mother's side. I had an uncle who played in a professional band. Several of my aunts sang in church choirs. I had Robbie, who in addition to her choir and lessons directed something called the Operetta Workshop, a shoestring musical theater program for kids. I attended every Saturday morning in the basement of her church. The musical center of my family, though, was my grandfather Shields, the carpenter, who was also Robbie's younger brother. He was a carefree, round-bellied man with an infectious laugh and a scraggly salt and pepper beard. When I was younger, he'd lived on the west side of the city, and Craig and I had referred to him as West Side. But he moved into our neighborhood the same year I started taking piano lessons, and we duly rechristened him South Side. South Side had separated from my grandmother decades earlier, when my mother was in her teens. He lived with my Aunt Carolyn, my mom's oldest sister, and my Uncle Steve, her youngest brother, just 2 blocks from us in a cozy 1-story house that he'd wired top to bottom for music, putting speakers in every room, including the bathroom. In the dining room, he built an elaborate cabinet system to hold his stereo equipment, much of it scavenged at yard sales. He had 2 mismatched turntables plus a rickety old reel-to-reel tape player, and shelves packed with records he'd collected over many years. There was a lot about the world that Southside didn't trust. He was kind of a classic old guy conspiracy theorist. He didn't trust dentists, which led to his having virtually no teeth. He didn't trust the police, and he didn't always trust white people, either, being the grandson of a Georgia slave, and having spent his early childhood in Alabama during the time of Jim Crow before coming north to Chicago in the 1920s. When he had kids of his own, Southside had taken pains to keep them safe, scaring them with real and imagined stories about what might happen to black kids who crossed into the wrong neighborhood, lecturing them about avoiding the police. Music seemed to be an antidote to his worries, a way to relax and crowd them out. When Southside had a payday for his carpentry work, he'd sometimes buy himself a new album. He threw regular parties for the family, forcing everyone to talk loudly over whatever he put on the stereo, because the music always dominated. We celebrated most major life events at Southside's house, which meant that over the years we unwrapped Christmas presents to Ella Fitzgerald and blew out birthday candles to Coltrane. According to my mother, as a younger man, Southside had made a point of pumping jazz into his 7 children, often waking everyone at sunrise by playing one of his records at full blast. His love for music was infectious. Once Southside moved to our neighborhood, I'd pass whole afternoons at his house, pulling albums from the shelf at random and putting them on his stereo, each one its own immersing adventure. Even though I was small, he put no restrictions on what I could touch. He'd later buy me my first album, Stevie Wonder's Talking Book, which I'd keep at his house on a special shelf he designated for my favorite records. If I was hungry, he'd make me a milkshake or fry us a whole chicken while we listened to Aretha or Miles or Billy. To me, Southside was as big as heaven. And heaven, as I envisioned it, had to be a place full of jazz. At home, I continued to work on my own progress as a musician. Sitting at Rohi's upright piano, I was quick to pick up the scales that osmosis thing was real, and I threw myself into filling out the sight-reading worksheets she gave me. Because we didn't have a piano of our own, I had to do my practicing downstairs on hers, waiting until nobody else was having a lesson, often dragging my mom with me to sit in the upholstered chair and listen to me play. I learned one song in the piano book, and then another. I was probably no better than her other students, no less fumbling, but I was driven. To me, there was magic in the learning. I got a buzzy sort of satisfaction from it. For one thing, I'd picked up on the simple, encouraging correlation between how long I practiced and how much I achieved. And I sensed something in Robbie as well too deeply buried to be outright pleasure. But still, a pulse of something lighter and happier coming from her when I made it through a song without messing up, when my right hand picked out a melody while my left touched down on a chord. I'd notice it out of the corner of my eye. Robbie's lips would unpurse themselves just slightly. Her tapping finger would pick up a little bounce. This, it turns out, was our honeymoon phase. It's possible that we might have continued this way, Robbie and I, had I been less curious and more reverent when it came to her piano method. But the lesson book was thick enough, and my progress on the opening few songs slow enough that I got impatient and started peeking ahead, and not just a few pages ahead, but deep into the book, checking out the titles of the more advanced songs and beginning, during my practice sessions, to fiddle around with playing them. When I proudly debuted one of my late-in-the-book songs for Robbie, she exploded, slapping down my achievement with a vicious good night. I got chewed out the way I'd heard her chewing out plenty of students before me. All I'd done was try to learn more and faster, but Robbie viewed it as a crime approaching treason. She wasn't impressed, not even a little bit. Nor was I chastened. I was the kind of kid who liked concrete answers to my questions, who liked to reason things out to some logical, if exhausting, end. I was lawyerly and also veered toward dictatorial, as my brother, who often got ordered out of our shared play area, would attest. When I thought I had a good idea about something, I didn't like being told no, which is how my great-aunt and I ended up in each other's faces, both of us hot and unyielding. How could you be mad at me for wanting to learn a new song? You're not ready for it. That's not how you learn piano. But I am ready. I just played it. That's not how it's done. But why? Piano lessons became epic and trying, largely due to my refusal to follow the prescribed method and Robbie's refusal to see anything good in my freewheeling approach to her songbook. We went back and forth, week after week, as I remember it. I was stubborn and so was she. I had a point of view and she did too. In between disputes, I continued to play the piano and she continued to listen, offering a stream of corrections. I gave her little credit for my improvement, as a player. She gave me little credit for improving. But still, the lessons went on. Upstairs, my parents and Craig found it all so very funny. They cracked up at the dinner table as I recounted my battles with Robbie, still seething as I ate my spaghetti and meatballs. Craig, for his part, had no issues with Robbie, being a cheerful kid and a by-the-book, marginally invested piano student. My parents expressed no sympathy for my woes and none for Robbie's either. In general, they weren't ones to intervene in matters outside schooling, expecting early on that my brother and I should handle our own business. They seemed to view their job as mostly to listen and bolster us as needed inside the four walls of our home. And where another parent might have scolded a kid for being sassy with an elder as I had been, they also let that be. My mother had lived with Robbie on and off since she was about 16, following every arcane rule the woman laid down, and it's possible she was secretly happy to see Robbie's authority challenged. Looking back on it now, I think my parents appreciated my feistiness, and I'm glad for it. It was a flame inside me they wanted to keep lit. 0 nay a year, Robbie held a fancy recital so that her students could perform for a live audience. To this day, I'm not sure how she managed it, but she somehow got access to a practice hall at Roosevelt University in downtown Chicago, holding her recitals in a grand stone building on Michigan Avenue, right near where the Chicago Symphony Orchestra played. Just thinking about going there made me nervous. Our apartment on Euclid Avenue was about 9 miles south of the Chicago Loop, which with its glittering skyscrapers and crowded sidewalks felt otherworldly to me. My family made trips into the heart of the city only a handful of times a year, to visit the Art Institute or see a play, the 4 of us traveling like astronauts in the capsule of my dad's Buick. My father loved any excuse to drive. He was devoted to his car, a bronze-colored 2-door Buick Electra 225, which he referred to with pride as the deuce and a quarter. He kept it buffed and waxed, and was religious about the maintenance schedule, taking it to Sears for tire rotations and oil changes the same way my mom carted us kids to the pediatrician for checkups. We loved the deuce and a quarter, too. It had smooth lines and narrow taillights that made it look cool and futuristic. It was roomy enough to feel like a house. I could practically stand up inside it, running my hands over the cloth-covered ceiling. This was back when wearing a seatbelt was optional, so most of the time Craig and I just flopped around in the rear, draping our bodies over the front seat when we wanted to talk to our parents. Half the time I'd pull myself up on the headrest and jut my chin forward so that my face could be next to my dad's and we'd have the exact same view. The car provided another form of closeness for my family, a chance to talk and travel at once. In the evenings after dinner, Craig and I would sometimes beg my dad to take us out for an aimless drive. As a treat on summer nights, we'd head to a drive-in theater southwest of our neighborhood to watch Planet of the Apes movies, parking the Buick at dusk and settling in for the show, my mother handing out a dinner of fried chicken and potato chips she'd brought from home, Craig and I eating it on our laps in the back seat, careful to wipe our hands on our napkins and not the seat. It would be years before I fully understood what driving the car meant to my father. As a kid, I could only sense the liberation he felt behind the wheel, the pleasure he took in having a smooth-running engine and perfectly balanced tires humming beneath him. He'd been in his 30s when a doctor informed him that the odd weakness he'd started to feel in one leg was just the beginning of a long and probably painful slide toward immobility. That odds were that someday, due to a mysterious unsheathing of neurons in his brain and spinal cord, he'd find himself unable to walk at all. I don't have the precise dates, but it seems that the Buick came into my father's life at roughly the same time that multiple sclerosis did. And though he never said it, the car had to provide some sort of sideways relief. The diagnosis was not something he or my mother dwelled upon. We were decades, still, from a time when a simple Google search would bring up a head-spinning array of charts, statistics, and medical explainers that either gave or took away hope. I doubt he would have wanted to see them anyway. Although my father was raised in the church, he wouldn't have prayed for God to spare him. He wouldn't have looked for alternative treatments or a guru or some faulty gene to blame. In my family, we have a long-standing habit of blocking out bad news, of trying to forget about it almost the moment it arrives. Nobody knew how long my father had been feeling poorly before he first took himself to the doctor. But my guess is it had already been months, if not years. He didn't like medical appointments. He wasn't interested in complaining. He was the sort of person who accepted what came and just kept moving forward. I do know that on the day of my big piano recital, he was already walking with a slight limp, his left foot unable to catch up to his right. All my memories of my father include some manifestation of his disability, even if none of us were quite willing to call it that yet. What I knew at the time was that my dad moved a bit more slowly than other dads. I sometimes saw him pausing before walking up a flight of stairs, as if needing to think through the maneuver before actually attempting it. When we went shopping at the mall, he'd park himself on a bench, content to watch the bags or sneak in a nap while the rest of the family roamed freely. Riding downtown for the piano recital, I sat in the back seat of the Buick wearing a nice dress and patent leather shoes, my hair in pigtails, experiencing the first cold sweat of my life. I was anxious about performing, even though back at home in Robbie's apartment I'd practiced my song practically to death. Craig, too, was in a suit and prepared to play his own song. But the prospect of it wasn't bothering him. He was sound asleep, in fact, knocked out cold in the back seat, his mouth agape, his expression blissful and unworried. This was Craig. I'd spend a lifetime admiring him for his ease. He was playing by then in a bitty basketball league that had games every weekend and apparently had already tamed his nerves around performing. My father would often pick a lot as close to our destination as possible, shelling out more money for parking to minimize how far he'd have to walk on his unsteady legs. That day, we found Roosevelt University with no trouble and made our way up to what seemed like an Enam One Us, echoing hall where the recital would take place. I felt tiny inside it. The room had elegant windows through which you could see the wide lawns of Grant Park and, beyond that, the white-capped swells of Lake Michigan. There were steel-gray chairs arranged in orderly rows, slowly filling with nervous kids and expectant parents. And at the front on a raised stage were the first two baby grand pianos I'd ever laid eyes on, their giant hardwood tops propped open like blackbird wings. Robbie was there, too, bustling about in a float print dress like the belle of the ball, albeit a matronly belle making sure all her students had arrived with sheet music in hand. She shushed the room to silence when it was time for the show to begin. I don't recall who played in what order that day. I only know that when it was my turn, I got up from my seat and walked with my very best posture to the front of the room, mounting the stairs and finding my seat at one of the gleaming baby grands. The truth is I was ready. As much as I found Robbie to be snippy and inflexible, I'd also internalized her devotion to rigor. I knew my song, so I hardly had to think about it. I just had to start moving my hands. And yet there was a problem, one I discovered in the split second it took to lift my little fingers to the keys. I was sitting at a perfect piano, it turned out, with its surfaces carefully dusted, its internal wires precisely tuned, its 88 keys laid out in a flawless ribbon of black and white. The issue was that I wasn't used to flawless. In fact, I'd never once in my life encountered it. My experience of the piano came entirely from Robbie's squat little music room, with its scraggly potted plant and view of our modest backyard. The only instrument I'd ever played was her less-than-perfect upright, with its honky-tonk patchwork of yellowed keys and its conveniently chipped middle C. To me, that's what a piano was, the same way my neighborhood was my neighborhood. My dad was my dad. My life was my life. It was all I knew. Now suddenly, I was aware of people watching me from their chairs as I stared hard at the high gloss of the piano keys, finding nothing there but sameness. I had no clue where to place my hands. With a tight throat and chugging heart, I looked out to the audience, trying not to telegraph my panic, searching for the safe harbor of my mother's face. Instead, I spotted a figure rising from the front row and slowly levitating in my direction. It was Robbie. We had brawled plenty by then, to the point where I viewed her a little bit like an enemy. But here in my moment of comeuppance, she arrived at my shoulder almost like an angel. Maybe she understood my shock. Maybe she knew that the disparities of the world had just quietly shown themselves to me for the first time. It's possible she needed simply to hurry things up. Either way, without a word, Robbie gently laid one finger on middle C so that I would know where to start. Then, turning back with the smallest smile of encouragement, she left me to play my song. I spent much of my childhood listening to the sounds of people trying. These weren't sounds of polished music, but the faltering notes of amateur piano students pressing away at Aunt Robbie's upright, the melody seeping through the walls of our apartment above. My family lived in a brick bungalow on Euclid Avenue, on the south side of Chicago. It was a modest two-story home my great-aunt Robbie and her husband, Terry, owned, and where my parents rented the second-floor apartment. Aunt Robbie was a strict and serious woman, someone who ran her part of the household with the same discipline she demanded of her piano students. She wore sensible heels and kept reading glasses on a chain around her neck, with a gaze that could snap into focus on anyone who was out of line. For those of us on the second floor, her piano lessons became a soundtrack of striving, the hesitant, sometimes jarring sounds of her students moving from basic scales to more complex pieces. I'd listen from my room as they tried to earn her approval, working through notes and errors until they got it right. Robbie's standards were high, and the sounds that floated up through the floorboards reflected that. Sometimes I imagined that she was as tough with herself as she was with everyone else. Our lives were shaped by this world of striving, by the work and lessons that surrounded us. My father, Fraser Robinson III, was a city laborer who wore a blue uniform to work each day. Despite a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, he was the kind of person who went to work, regardless of how he felt. I didn't know the words to explain it then, but he had a quiet resilience, an unspoken strength that felt as solid as the walls around us. He didn't talk about his illness, choosing instead to focus on what he could control. Watching him, I learned early what it meant to keep going, to hold yourself steady in the face of challenges. Our apartment was small, with Craig and me sharing a makeshift bedroom that our grandfather had divided with a thin partition, providing us each a little nook of our own. Craig, my older brother, had the kind of charm that made people light up. He was athletic, easygoing, and had a way of making friends wherever he went, moving confidently into places that seemed too grown-up for me. He was my partner in everything. We'd lie in our beds, separated by that flimsy wall, and toss a bald sock back and forth, or whisper about school until one of us fell asleep. Craig made me feel safe, a little braver. He was my first role model. Our family was filled with quiet, grounding moments that sustained us. My mother, Marion, held us together with a steady, unwavering presence, always encouraging Craig and me to think for ourselves. She was practical, letting us learn from experience, though she kept a watchful eye on us. The trips to the library with her were some of my earliest adventures, where I first discovered the thrill of learning. She'd sit with me as I sounded out words, nurturing in me a curiosity that would drive me long after I'd outgrown those early readers. Education, she seemed to say without words, was something to value and cherish. The South Side was our world, a neighborhood brimming with a sense of familiarity. We knew the people on our block, and we grew up among the sounds of their lives, the rhythms of everyday striving, laughter, and the music that seemed to float out of open windows on warm summer nights. Our neighborhood was changing, though. White families, one by one, began leaving for the suburbs, seeking schools, space, and perhaps something they felt was missing here. But to me, the South Side was home. It was all I knew, and it felt complete. In the early evenings, my father would settle into his chair with the Cubs game on TV, explaining each play with patient enthusiasm. We weren't a family of big plans or grand gestures, but rather a family shaped by simple traditions, by a sense of shared purpose that was as grounding as the steady rhythm of the piano lessons below. As I grew older, these rituals became part of my understanding of what it meant to belong, to be part of something greater than yourself. Craig and I were close. He took to sports naturally, joining games wherever he could, while I was the quieter of the two of us, preferring the universe of my dolls and the stories I created with them. My Barbies had a world of their own, a soap opera of sorts, with each one assigned a personality and a history. I'd play for hours, arranging them in little kingdoms made out of blocks, giving each one a life that felt as vivid to me as the world outside our door. Sometimes I'd watch from our window as the neighborhood came alive, Mr. Thompson across the street loading his bass guitar into his Cadillac, the Mendoza family returning home in their pickup after a day's work, their dogs barking excitedly at their arrival. Our block was diverse and familiar, a mix of families who seemed to have been there forever, each household with its own rhythm and its own story. My friends were a mix, too, Rachel with her British mother, Susie with her fiery red curls, and others who, like us, belonged to this place in ways that felt both simple and profound. Even as children, though, we could feel the changes. With each for sale sign, a family would move away, often with little explanation, and someone new would arrive, each departure quietly reshaping our sense of community. It was a slow drift, a feeling that became harder to ignore, especially as we entered school. Classrooms, once diverse, grew more uniform, with fewer white faces each year. One summer, feeling the weight of these changes, I started venturing out more, tailing Craig as he moved through the neighborhood, hoping to find my place among the kids of Euclid Parkway. But first, I had to face Dee Dee, a girl whose cutting remarks left me feeling out of place. Eventually, my frustration got the better of me, and I challenged her in a way I hadn't expected, showing a side of myself I didn't yet know I had. In that moment, I learned something about respect and belonging. Though we were never close friends, Dee Dee and I reached an unspoken understanding, and I became part of the neighborhood fold. My dad's car, a two-door Buick he called the Deuce and a Quarter, was our portal to the larger world. On Sundays, he'd take us for drives, sometimes to the more affluent parts of the South Side, where lawns were manicured and flower beds lined the walkways. He viewed wealth with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, telling us stories about the people we'd pass. Owning a house, he explained, was a privilege but also a responsibility, one that could sometimes trap people in ways they hadn't foreseen. At home, Craig and I lived a life of careful abundance. Our family couldn't afford luxuries, but we had small celebrations, a pizza from Italian Fiesta to mark good report cards, or a pint of hand-packed ice cream in the summer. Every year, We'd visit my dad's water filtration plant for the air and water show, the fighter jets swooping over Lake Michigan as we watched from a grassy lawn. Family vacations were simple but full of laughter. We'd pile into the Buick and head north to a cabin in Michigan, spending days by the pool while my parents relaxed and played cards. My father's love for us was evident in those moments, his pride and joy radiating from the way he tossed us into the water, his laughter ringing out as he joined us in play. Even then, he was teaching us to value the moments we had together, to find joy in the simple things. As the years passed, I started to sense the fragility of it all, the way our world was slowly shifting, reshaping itself with each family that moved away. By the time I entered second grade, I could feel it in my classroom, in the strained attempts of a teacher who struggled to manage her students. The once familiar rhythms of my childhood were slowly giving way to new ones, reshaping the landscape of our neighborhood and our lives. In these early years, I learned what it meant to hold on to what mattered, to build strength and resilience in a world that was always changing. My family, my community, the sounds of striving that filled our home, these became the foundation of my life, a lesson in what it meant to belong, to strive, and to keep moving forward. In the summers, I spent more time out in the neighborhood, moving beyond the boundaries of our backyard and onto Euclid Parkway, where a little world of kids seemed to live in their own rhythm, as though time slowed there just for them. Euclid Parkway was a small oasis of shared lawns free of cars, where kids darted around like flocks of birds, yelling and laughing, absorbed in their own games. It was here I first encountered Dee Dee, a girl with a sharp tongue and a stare that could make you feel like you didn't belong. She had a way of turning her words into a weapon, and every time I showed up, she'd throw out some sneering comment as if I'd interrupted her kingdom. I don't know what came over me that day when I finally had enough, but I snapped back, matching her energy, throwing my words right back at her. A fight broke out between us, a storm of kicking and shoving. Kids gathered around, cheering us on, until we were finally pulled apart, breathing hard, but something had changed. I'd earned Dee Dee's respect. I was part of Euclid Parkway now. At home, my parents kept the kind of steady presence that felt like gravity, always there, quiet but grounding. My dad went to work every day without complaint, his blue uniform crisp and clean, despite the fact that multiple sclerosis was creeping into his life, weakening him slowly. It was as though he refused to acknowledge the illness, as if sheer will alone could keep it from taking over. He never talked about the pain, about what it took to get up each morning and put on that uniform, to keep working day after day. But I knew. I could see it in the way he walked, in the quiet wince that crossed his face when he thought no one was watching. Watching him, I learned what it meant to keep going, to hold on to your strength even when life tried to take it from you. Sundays were for family, for visits to see Grandma and Dandy at Parkway Gardens. My dad's younger siblings, Francesca, Andrew, and Carlton, were only a few years older than me, and they felt more like cousins than aunts and uncles. They were young and full of energy, dressed in bell-bottom jeans and leather jackets, talking about things like soul power, and listening to music that felt like it belonged to a different world. I watched Francesca, admiring the way she seemed so sure of herself, so effortlessly beautiful. Andrew and Carlton talked about Malcolm X, about pride and power, about being black in a world that didn't always see us. I listened to them with wide eyes, absorbing their words, feeling a quiet spark in me as they spoke. They were showing me pieces of a world I hadn't known existed, parts of my own identity that I was only beginning to understand. The South Side was changing, shifting in ways that I felt but couldn't fully explain. White families moved out, heading to the suburbs, leaving behind streets that grew emptier year by year. And yet, for me, the South Side was still home, filled with people I loved, people who shared a common thread of resilience. Our neighborhood was a place where stories were exchanged over fences, where Mr. Thompson from across the street would play his bass guitar on his front porch, filling the air with music. It was a world rich with culture, with history, with the kind of beauty that didn't need to announce itself. At school, I started noticing things too. The teachers who looked at me with an extra measure of surprise when I spoke up, the way they seemed to think I was something unexpected, as if my abilities were a pleasant surprise. I learned to carry myself with pride, to speak clearly, to show them that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. It was in those moments, sitting in my small desk, raising my hand to answer questions, that I began to understand the power of my own voice. These were the years when I felt my identity start to take shape, molded by the love and strength of my family, by the rhythms of our neighborhood, by the way my father's quiet determination and my mother's unwavering support lifted me up. I began to see myself not just as a kid on Euclid Avenue, but as someone who could make a mark, someone who could rise above expectations. And somewhere in that quiet realization, I began to understand that becoming wasn't about reaching some destination. It was about embracing each moment, each challenge, each triumph, and growing through it all. The world was shifting, and so was I. I was 14, and the south side of Chicago seemed to hold two different versions of itself. On one hand, there was the familiar neighborhood around Euclid Avenue, with its comforting rhythm, a place where I could walk down the street and recognize faces, see houses that had been there forever, and wave to neighbors who knew me well. But there was also a different side to this place, a quieter, starker reality that became harder to ignore as I got older. I could see it in the rows of houses, some kept tidy, others boarded up, abandoned by families who decided to move on. The south side was changing, and it was clear, even to a kid like me, that the change wasn't just about people moving. It was about who was allowed to stay, who had to leave, and why. I was about to start high school, and it felt like a door was opening into a new world that was quite literally beyond the south side. I'd been accepted into Whitney M., Young Magnet High School, a school on the near west side, almost an hour's commute from our house. Whitney Young was one of Chicago's first magnet schools, created to help integrate public education by pulling in kids from different neighborhoods. To me, it felt like a portal, an opportunity to see and experience things that would have been unimaginable if I'd stayed within the same few square blocks of Euclid Avenue. Getting into Whitney Young had meant going through a rigorous application process, and for the first time, I felt the thrill of competition. It was a big deal, a sense of having earned something because I'd worked for it, proved myself capable. I was ready for the challenge, though. I wanted the chance to explore what lay beyond the south side, even if it was only for a school day. Every morning, I'd get on the bus, leaving behind the neat little row of houses on Euclid Avenue, and I'd travel across the city, past neighborhoods that were cleaner, brighter, or simply different from my own. Whitney Young was as new and diverse as it was intimidating. I'd see kids from every corner of Chicago, coming from places and backgrounds that seemed wildly different from mine. Some of them had parents who were lawyers, doctors, or even university professors. There were kids with a kind of polish and ease in themselves that came from having a certain kind of life. They had traveled, they went to camps, and they talked about their summer vacations in ways that made me feel like my own summers, spent mostly on Euclid, were part of a different reality altogether. I quickly realized that the curriculum was as intense as the student body was diverse. The school's standards were high, and my teachers expected more than just showing up. You had to push yourself if you wanted to succeed here, and I found myself driven by a deep need to prove that I could belong. I was a dedicated student, and I knew how to work hard, how to focus. But there was something about Whitney Young that pushed me beyond my comfort zone, that made me reach for more. I wanted the A's not just for the grades, but because I wanted to prove to myself and to everyone around me that I belonged, that I had a place in this world that was opening up before me. At home, I kept all these feelings mostly to myself. My parents, Marion and Fraser, were my quiet support, the solid ground beneath my feet. They never talked about their own dreams, never made a big show of encouraging Craig and me to excel. They simply expected us to do well, to make the most of what we had. My father, whose health was declining steadily due to his multiple sclerosis, was as steady as ever, heading to work each day without complaint, without a word about the toll it was taking on him. I watched him and saw what strength really looked like, a quiet, unbreakable resolve. It made me realize that succeeding at school wasn't just about proving myself. It was a way to honor the sacrifices my parents made every day. Whitney Young was a revelation in more ways than one. It taught me how big and complex the world really was, how many different kinds of lives there were, even within a single city. And for the first time, I was encountering people who didn't look like me, who hadn't grown up with the same values, or who simply saw the world differently. It was both exhilarating and humbling. I realized that there were kids who'd been given opportunities from the moment they were born, who seemed almost to take for granted the things I'd worked so hard to achieve. But instead of feeling discouraged, it made me more determined. If they could belong here, so could I. My days at Whitney Young stretched me, made me think about the future in a way I hadn't before. I started imagining a world beyond Chicago, beyond even the boundaries of the Midwest. College became a possibility that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I wasn't just thinking about staying close to home, about attending a local university. I started to wonder about places like Princeton, where I'd heard that the standards were impossibly high, the classes rigorous, the student body filled with the best and brightest from all over the country. I didn't know anyone who'd been to an Ivy League school, but the idea lodged itself in my mind, growing steadily like a seed, waiting for the right time to bloom. With each passing year, Whitney Young became more than just a school to me. It was a proving ground. I made friends, some who shared my ambitions, others who came from worlds I was only just beginning to understand. We'd study together, laugh together, share dreams and worries that felt enormous, too big to carry on our own. The friendships I made there were some of the first that went beyond the boundaries of the South Side, that opened up my perspective in ways I could never have anticipated. I was still the girl from Euclid Avenue, but I was also becoming someone new, someone who saw a bigger world, who believed she had a place in it. Whitney Young taught me that ambition was not only okay, it was essential. It taught me that I could stretch, that I could grow, that I could claim a place for myself. And in that process, I began to see that becoming was not about arriving at a destination. It was about embracing every challenge, every opportunity, every moment of self-discovery along the way. Each day I stepped onto that bus and left Euclid Avenue behind, I felt myself growing, reaching, becoming something more. It was a journey I knew would take me far, even if I couldn't see exactly where I was headed. And as I rode across the city, heading toward Whitney Young, I carried with me the quiet strength of my father, the resilience of my mother, and the unspoken belief that somehow, I was exactly where I was meant to be. By the time I was in middle school, my world felt small and big at the same time, wrapped up in the rhythms of my family and neighborhood, while hints of a larger, more complicated world began to filter in. Each day, my brother Craig and I would head off to school, navigating the streets of Chicago's South Side. We'd pass familiar houses and neighbors, waving at Mr. Thompson, who'd load his guitar into his car for another late-night gig, and the Mendozas, a family with an endless stream of dogs that ran through their backyard. Euclid Avenue, with its patchwork of buildings and the stories held within, felt like a world unto itself. School was both an escape and a proving ground, a place where I could let my curiosity and ambition run free. I was driven, the kind of kid who wanted nothing less than an A on every assignment, not because my parents demanded it, but because I wanted it for myself. For me, each accomplishment was a small victory, a reassurance that I belonged. But belonging wasn't something that came naturally in every space. In 5th grade, I joined a gifted class, where I was one of the only black kids, surrounded by white faces and an unspoken pressure to prove myself. These classes felt different, their expectations slightly higher, the teacher's attention more focused. The kids spoke in voices that were confident and sharp, used to being listened to. I was aware of my differences in these moments, the contrast between my life at home, with parents who hadn't gone to college, and the homes of some of these kids, who spoke casually of vacations and summer camps. And yet, I pushed myself, determined to belong, to claim my spot. At home, my parents were my grounding force, a reminder of where I came from. My dad, who worked tirelessly at his job despite his MS, was a quiet hero in my eyes. Every morning, he'd pull on his uniform, lace up his boots, and head off to work, never complaining, even as his illness made each step harder. Watching him, I understood that strength wasn't always loud or obvious. It was something you carried quietly, with dignity, something you just did day after day. And my mother was no different. She made sure our lives were organized, our schoolwork checked, and our dreams encouraged, though she kept her aspirations for us unspoken. Her love was practical and steady, like the rhythm of her sewing machine as she hemmed curtains or fixed a tear in one of Craig's jackets. I learned from her that support didn't need to be flashy. It was in the steady presence, the quiet belief that we would do something good with our lives. Outside of home, I found myself becoming more aware of the world's challenges, especially as my neighborhood shifted. White families moved away, driven by the changing demographics, leaving empty houses and altering the once familiar landscape. The South Side was in a state of flux, and though I didn't fully understand it, I sensed that these changes would somehow shape my future, too. It was a reminder that the world wasn't always fair, that sometimes you had to carve out your own place, to fight for what you wanted. With each passing year, I was beginning to understand that life was a balance of these worlds, the support of home, the challenges of school, the changing face of our neighborhood. And through it all, I held on to the quiet lessons my parents taught me. Resilience, hard work, and the courage to stand my ground, even when the world around me felt uncertain. In the years that followed, high school transformed from an intimidating new world into a place where I felt fully engaged, energized by the work, the friendships, and the sense of purpose I found there. Whitney Young Magnet High School had become more than just a school to me. It was a stepping stone, a place that filled me with ambition and showed me what was possible if I put my mind to it. The students there were smart, competitive, driven, and that energy surrounded me, pushing me to do better, to aim higher. Whitney Young was downtown, miles away from my neighborhood on the south side, and each day, as I boarded the bus, I felt like I was crossing into a different world. The journey became a ritual of sorts, a way to prepare myself for the day ahead. I'd sit by the window, watching the city pass by, feeling a blend of excitement and anxiety as I left behind the familiarity of my neighborhood. My classmates came from different parts of Chicago, from families and communities that didn't look like mine, and I began to see how much of a bubble I'd lived in until then. These students had different experiences, different challenges, and different dreams, but we all shared a drive to succeed, to make something of ourselves. I wanted to be a part of that world, to claim my place among them. I became immersed in my studies, often working late into the night, poring over textbooks and assignments with a determination that surprised even me. My parents encouraged me, of course, but they didn't need to push. They trusted me to find my way, to do what was best for me, and I did. I was a disciplined student, a perfectionist who aimed to get everything right. When I got a grade that was less than an A, it felt like the end of the world. But those moments only made me more determined, more focused on proving that I belonged at Whitney Young, that I could hold my own among these exceptional students. It wasn't all about academics, though. Whitney Young also introduced me to the world of extracurriculars, to clubs and activities that gave me a chance to explore new interests and make new friends. I joined the student council, where I learned to speak up, to advocate for myself and others, and to understand the power of teamwork. I also joined the yearbook committee, working late into the evening with my classmates to put together the book that would capture the spirit of our school. Those evenings were filled with laughter and camaraderie, with the feeling that we were all part of something bigger, something that mattered. As I grew more comfortable at Whitney Young, I also started to think about the future in a more serious way. I'd always wanted to go to college, of course, but now it felt like a real, tangible goal, something that was within reach if I worked hard enough. I began to imagine myself at a place like Princeton or Harvard, one of the Ivy League schools I'd heard so much about. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. I didn't know anyone who had gone to an Ivy League school. It was a world that felt foreign and intimidating. But I wanted to be a part of it, to see if I could make it in that world, to prove to myself that I was just as capable as anyone else. I knew that getting into a school like Princeton would require more than just good grades. I needed to stand out, to show that I was more than just another smart kid from the South Side. So I pushed myself even harder, taking on extra assignments, joining more clubs, doing everything I could to build a resume that would catch the eye of an admissions officer. It was exhausting, but I was driven by a sense of purpose, a belief that this was my chance to make something of myself, to create a future that was bigger and brighter than anything I could have imagined. My family supported me in their own quiet way, giving me the space I needed to focus on my studies, to chase my dreams. My father, despite his illness, continued to work every day, showing me what it meant to be strong, to persevere even when things were difficult. My mother, who was my constant source of support, managed our home with a quiet grace, making sure that Craig and I had everything we needed. They never complained, never pressured me to do more or be more. They simply believed in me, trusted me to find my own way, and that trust gave me the confidence to keep going, to push through the challenges and setbacks. As the years went by, I began to feel a growing sense of responsibility, a desire to give back to the community that had shaped me. I saw the struggles of the people around me, the challenges faced by families who didn't have the same opportunities one had, and I wanted to do something to help. I started volunteering, working with younger students who needed help with their studies, mentoring them, encouraging them to aim high. It was a small thing, but it made me feel like I was making a difference, like I was part of something bigger. The thought of leaving Whitney Young, of leaving Chicago, was bittersweet. I loved my school, my city, my family, and the idea of going off to college, of starting a new life in a place that was so different from everything I'd known, was both exciting and terrifying. But I knew it was the right choice, that this was my chance to create the future I'd dreamed of. And so, as my senior year came to an end, I I prepared myself to say goodbye, to leave behind the people and places that had shaped me, and to step into a new world, one that I hoped would be as full of possibility and promise as Whitney Young had been. In the end, it wasn't about leaving the South Side behind or escaping from my past. It was about carrying those experiences with me, about using everything I'd learned, everything I'd been given, to create a life that would make my family, my community, and myself proud. I was ready for whatever came next, ready to take on the challenges, to embrace the opportunities, to keep pushing forward, to keep becoming. High school became the center of my world, a place where ambition and discovery blended together, forming a kind of magnetic pull. Each day at Whitney Young, I was surrounded by students whose lives seemed both familiar and foreign to me. They were smart, driven, and competitive, yes, but so many of them came from backgrounds that felt worlds apart from my own. Their homes were filled with opportunities I'd never had, a sort of privilege that wasn't just about money, but about the invisible doors that had always been open to them. Some of them spoke of family vacations to Europe or of summer camps that focused on leadership or debate. I listened, fascinated by their stories, feeling my world expand and shrink at the same time. One of my closest friends during this time was Santita Jackson, who had a presence and poise I admired deeply. Santita was the daughter of Reverend Jesse Jackson, a man whose name alone carried weight. The Jackson family was respected and known far beyond the South Side of Chicago, recognized for their activism and influence. Santita's world seemed filled with intensity, her days often marked by the work her father was doing to change the nation's view on race, equality, and justice. Their lives were constantly in motion, a whirlwind of rallies, meetings, and appearances. It was impossible not to be drawn into their orbit. Spending time with Santita, I saw firsthand what it meant to be dedicated to a cause that was bigger than any one person, a family that was living a public mission. Sometimes, a simple outing with Santita would turn into a full-blown political event. We'd head to Hyde Park and end up at Operation Push, the headquarters of Reverend Jackson's organization, where people gathered with hope, anger, and determination. They wanted to be part of something, to fight for a future they believed was possible. I'd sit quietly, watching as Reverend Jackson spoke to the crowds, his words sweeping through the room, capturing the people's dreams and frustrations. It was a side of Chicago I hadn't known, a place where activism was alive and tangible, where each face in the crowd carried a story, a struggle, and a fierce desire to make things better. Despite her family's public life, Santita was a teenager just like me. We spent hours lying on her bedroom floor, talking about our futures, our fears, and our hopes. I was curious, unsure, but eager to learn, to absorb everything around me. Santita's perspective gave me a glimpse into a world that was, in many ways, larger than mine. Her father was part of history, of a movement, and I wondered how it felt to grow up under the weight of those expectations. Watching Santita navigate her world with grace, I admired her ability to remain true to herself despite the whirlwind of her family's life. Back at Whitney Young, I was determined to keep proving myself, to keep reaching for those high expectations I'd set. My academic load was heavy, my schedule packed with activities. I joined clubs, ran for student government, and pushed myself to balance it all without letting my grades slip. Each assignment felt like a small step toward my future, a way to show the world that I belonged here, that I was capable, that I could keep up with the best. My family didn't have much, but they had given me all they could, and I wanted to make them proud. My father's resilience was my silent motivation. Despite his illness, he continued working, pulling on his blue work uniform each morning without complaint, his strength unspoken but ever present. Watching him struggle to climb the stairs to our apartment, seeing the way he fought against his failing body, I understood that strength wasn't always visible. It was quiet, steady, and unyielding. My father's example taught me what it meant to persevere, to keep going even when it hurt. He made me realize that every effort I made at school was my way of honoring his sacrifice, of acknowledging the unspoken support that held me up. As my high school years passed, college became an increasingly real possibility. I'd always dreamed of going to college, but now that dream was taking shape, growing into something more defined. I wanted to reach beyond Chicago, to see what else the world had to offer. My eyes were set on Princeton, a name I'd heard but had never dared to imagine for myself. The idea of going to an Ivy League school was thrilling and daunting. I didn't know anyone who had gone to a place like Princeton. It felt like a world that wasn't meant for me, yet the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to try, to push myself to reach that far. The application process was intense, but I was ready for it. I knew that good grades alone wouldn't be enough, that I needed to stand out, to show Princeton who I was and why I belonged. So, I joined every club I could, took on every responsibility that came my way, worked harder than ever to build a resume that would catch someone's attention. It was exhausting, but I was driven by a desire to create a future for myself, to prove that I could make it in a world far beyond Euclid Avenue. My parents supported me in their quiet way, never pushing, but always there when I needed them. They didn't understand everything about my college dreams, didn't fully grasp the significance of an Ivy League education, but they trusted me. My father never questioned my ambition, even though he hadn't had the chance to attend college himself. My mother managed our home with a steady hand, keeping everything in order so that I could focus on my studies, on building a future that felt increasingly within reach. Their trust, their quiet support, gave me the confidence I needed to keep going, to keep striving for more. Beyond my own dreams, I felt a growing sense of responsibility. I wanted to give back, to help others who didn't have the same opportunities one had been given. I began volunteering with younger students, helping them with their studies, mentoring them, encouraging them to dream bigger. It was a small thing, but it made me feel like I was part of something larger, like I was giving back to the community that had shaped me. I saw the struggles of families on the South Side, the challenges they faced, and I wanted to do something to make a difference, even in the smallest way. As graduation approached, the idea of leaving Chicago became both exhilarating and terrifying. I loved my city, my school, my family. Leaving felt like stepping into the unknown, a leap into a world that was so far beyond what I'd known. But I knew it was the right choice, that this was my chance to build something new, something that would make my family proud. I wanted to carry the strength of my father, the resilience of my mother, the unbreakable bonds of my community with me as I stepped into this next chapter. Looking back on my years at Whitney Young, I saw how much I had grown, how the school had given me a new understanding of myself and the world. I was still the girl from Euclid Avenue, but I was also someone who had stretched, who had reached beyond what I'd thought possible. I had learned that ambition wasn't something to hide, that it was okay to want more, to push beyond the limitations the world sometimes tried to impose. I had discovered the power of becoming, the beauty of a life that was constantly expanding, constantly evolving. As I prepared to leave Whitney Young, I felt a mix of emotions, excitement, fear, gratitude. I knew that I was about to embark on a journey that would change me, that would challenge everything I thought I knew. But I was ready. I was ready to take on the world, to keep pushing forward, to keep becoming. By the time I reached Princeton, the world felt bigger and more complex than ever before. I stepped onto the campus with both excitement and trepidation, aware of the vast differences between my life on the south side of Chicago and the privileged world I was entering. Princeton was sprawling and grand, with its iconic Gothic architecture, wide-open lawns, and libraries stacked floor to ceiling with books. The air was thick with a quiet, almost reverent atmosphere that hinted at the generations of young minds that had come through this place, each one leaving behind a part of themselves while taking a bit of Princeton with them. Arriving as one of the few Black students, I knew that in many ways, I was a stranger here. Many of my peers came from private schools, places where attending an Ivy League school was almost a foregone conclusion. They carried themselves with a confidence that felt foreign to me. They had a kind of effortless ease that suggested they'd been preparing for Princeton their whole lives, and I was keenly aware of how different my own path had been. For many of them, Princeton was a continuation of the privilege they'd known. For me, it was a new frontier, a place that felt as intimidating as it was inspiring. Settling in wasn't easy. I quickly learned that while I'd excelled in my public high school, the standards here were even higher, and the pressure was relentless. I threw myself into my studies with a kind of fierce determination, determined not only to keep up but to prove, perhaps mostly to myself, that I belonged here. Late nights in the library became my norm, and I would spend hours poring over textbooks, wrestling with complex ideas, and pushing myself to master subjects that were both challenging and foreign. Yet, despite my focus, there were moments when I couldn't help but feel the weight of isolation. Being one of the few Black students at Princeton came with a sense of responsibility and visibility that I hadn't anticipated. I could sense the unspoken expectations, the scrutiny. I felt as though every success or failure would be seen not just as my own, but as a reflection on all Black students, which added a layer of pressure that I carried quietly. There were times when I longed for the familiarity of the South Side, for the warmth of home and the comfort of people who knew me without needing explanations. Fortunately, there were spaces within Princeton where I found a sense of belonging. The Third World Center, a place dedicated to supporting students of color, became my sanctuary. Here, I met other students who shared my experiences and who understood the feeling of navigating a world that wasn't always welcoming. We'd gather in the evenings, sometimes laughing over shared jokes, other times discussing the challenges we faced and the questions that kept us up at night. This community became my foundation, a place where I could relax, let down my guard, and be fully myself without needing to prove anything. I also found an intellectual partner in my roommate, Suzanne. She came from a background quite different from mine, and yet we connected in ways that felt genuine and profound. We were both ambitious, both determined to make the most of our time at Princeton. And in her, I found a friend who was as serious about her studies as I was. Our late-night conversations often veered into deep discussions about life, about our hopes and fears, and about the future we both envisioned. With Suzanne, I felt both challenged and supported, and she became an anchor in a world that often felt overwhelming. Academically, Princeton was a crucible. My major in sociology allowed me to explore questions that were deeply personal to me, questions about race, class, and the social structures that shape our lives. I became fascinated by the patterns and systems that govern society, by the ways in which privilege and power were distributed, and by the challenges faced by those who lived on the margins. I saw echoes of my own life in the theories we studied, and this understanding fueled my commitment to succeed. In one class, I was tasked with conducting research on the experiences of Black alumni at Princeton. This project became more than just an academic assignment. It was a deeply personal journey. I reached out to Black graduates, listening to their stories, their triumphs, and the obstacles they had overcome. Their resilience inspired me, and their experiences gave me a sense of continuity, a feeling that I was part of a larger story that extended beyond my own life. Their stories reminded me that I wasn't alone, that I was walking a path that others had paved, and that my presence at Princeton was both a privilege and a responsibility. Despite the challenges, my time at Princeton taught me the value of resilience. I learned how to navigate spaces that weren't built for me, how to hold my ground even when I felt out of place, and how to push forward even when doubt crept in. I realized that belonging wasn't something that was given. It was something I had to claim for myself. And with each semester, with each paper I submitted and each test I passed, I felt myself growing, evolving, becoming more than I had been. Princeton didn't change who I was, but it sharpened me, molding me into a version of myself that was both stronger and more self-aware. I began to see my differences not as weaknesses, but as strengths, as qualities that gave me a unique perspective, a voice that was both valid and valuable. And as I walked through the ivy-covered arches and along the cobblestone paths, I carried with me the pride of my family, the strength of my community, and the quiet resilience that my parents had instilled in me. The journey wasn't easy, and there were times when I questioned whether I'd made the right choice in coming to Princeton. But as I prepared to graduate, I realized that every challenge, every moment of doubt, had been part of my growth, part of my journey toward becoming the person I was meant to be. And in the end, I knew that Princeton had given me more than an education. It had given me a sense of purpose, a belief in myself, and a vision for the future that I would carry with me long after I left its gates. In Chapter 9, we enter a new era, a shift from self-discovery to connection, as my journey at Princeton and then Harvard Law unfolds, ultimately leading me to Chicago, where I would meet the man who would become a central part of my life. This section, Becoming Us, captures not only my evolving sense of self, but the beginnings of a shared journey, one that would change the course of both our lives. After Princeton, I felt the weight of new possibilities, and with it came a kind of exhilaration I hadn't felt before. I was stepping into a world that I'd imagined from a distance, knowing it would challenge me in ways I'd never experienced. Harvard Law was a name that carried power, a place where the best minds gathered to learn the complexities of the legal system and the structures that govern society. To be there felt like an arrival, a chance to prove once again that I could thrive, no matter where I came from. But it was also daunting, and as I began my journey at Harvard, I found myself navigating yet another world that was markedly different from the South Side of Chicago. The first few weeks were intense. My days filled up with endless reading assignments, dense cases that seemed to pile up faster than I could get through them, each one packed with legal language that required hours to fully absorb. We'd debate, analyze, and then analyze again, each student eager to prove their point, to show the sharpness of their minds. I knew how to work hard. I'd been preparing for this rigor for years. But Harvard was something else. It felt as if every student came with an arsenal of knowledge and confidence that was both intimidating and inspiring. Many of my classmates came from legal families or had spent summers interning at firms. They understood the nuances, the language of law, in ways I didn't yet. They'd throw around legal terms casually, with an ease I envied. For them, Harvard law felt almost like a rite of passage, a step in a path that had been laid out for them since birth. For me, it was an entirely new world, one I'd fought hard to reach, but that still felt unfamiliar. I felt the pressure to prove myself, not just for me, but for the community I came from, for the people who hadn't had the same opportunities, who might never walk the halls of a place like this. But as the days wore on, I settled into a rhythm. I found that my discipline, the drive that had carried me through Whitney Young and Princeton, became my armor. I spent long hours in the library, poring over textbooks, analyzing cases, preparing for each class with the meticulousness of someone who knew they couldn't afford to fall behind. I was here, and I intended to make the most of it, to prove that I belonged, even if the environment sometimes made me question that. Being one of the few Black women in my class came with its own unique challenges. I'd be in a classroom filled with men, many of whom were white, many of whom were well-versed in the language of law. I could feel their eyes on me whenever I spoke, a subtle, unspoken curiosity as if they wondered what I, someone who looked so different from them, had to say. There were moments when the isolation crept in, when I felt the weight of being a minority in an overwhelmingly privileged space. I knew that every success or failure would be amplified, that it would be seen not just as a reflection of my own abilities, but as a reflection on Black women as a whole. That pressure, though unspoken, felt heavy at times. Fortunately, I found solace in the few friends I made, people who understood the challenges and the loneliness that could come with being different at a place like Harvard. We bonded over late-night study sessions, over shared jokes and mutual support, over the unspoken understanding that, in a world that wasn't always welcoming, we had each other. We were a small group, but we found strength in our connections, a quiet resilience that helped us face each day. My roommate, Suzanne, became a close friend and confidant. Though our backgrounds were different, we shared a fierce determination and a love for learning. Our late-night conversations often turned philosophical, diving into our fears, our hopes, and the possibilities we imagined for ourselves. With Suzanne, I felt a kinship, a shared sense of purpose that made Harvard feel a little less daunting. She was as serious about her studies as I was, and we pushed each other, supported each other, and in those quiet moments, we reminded each other that we weren't alone. Studying law began to shift my perspective in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd chosen sociology as my major at Princeton because it allowed me to study society, to understand the forces that shaped communities and lives. Law felt like the next step in that journey, a way to understand the structures and systems that governed our world. I was captivated by the idea that the law could be a tool for change, a way to create a fairer, more just society. I saw echoes of my own life in the theories we studied, in the cases that explored issues of race, class, and justice. One assignment in particular stayed with me, a research project on the experiences of Black alumni at Harvard. As I interviewed graduates, listening to their stories, I found a sense of continuity, a connection to the past that gave me strength. They spoke of the challenges they'd faced, the isolation, the pressures, but also of the pride they felt in paving the way for students like me. Their stories reminded me that I was part of something larger, that my journey at Harvard was a continuation of the work they'd begun. Their resilience inspired me, and in their stories, I found a sense of belonging that made the campus feel a little less foreign. After graduating, I returned to Chicago, ready to take everything I'd learned and put it to use. I wanted to give back, to serve the community that had shaped me, to use my skills to make a tangible impact. I accepted a job at Sidley & Austin, a prestigious corporate law firm. It was a polished, high-powered environment filled with ambitious lawyers and endless hours. My days were filled with cases, meetings, the steady hum of office life. It was here, in the midst of the firm's sharp professionalism, that I would meet a young, brilliant intern named Barack Obama. Barack was unlike anyone I'd met. He carried himself with a calm confidence, an assuredness that made you want to lean in to listen. He was whip-smart, of course, but there was something else, a depth, a sense of purpose that felt rare. From our first meeting, I was intrigued. He didn't seem to be motivated by ambition alone. He wanted something more, something meaningful. We spent hours talking, sharing our ideas, our dreams, our different experiences growing up Black in America. He came from Hawaii, from Indonesia, a world far removed from my South Side. Yet, there was a connection, an understanding that seemed to bridge our differences. Barack wasn't interested in corporate law. He wanted to work in public service, to serve people directly, to be on the ground. I admired his vision, his dedication to making a difference. He spoke about community organizing, about the importance of understanding people's stories, their struggles, their needs. It was a perspective that felt close to my own, yet somehow broader, more expansive. Being around him made me see my own work in a new light, made me consider the impact I wanted to have. As we grew closer, I found myself thinking of him more often, replaying our conversations, our shared laughs. We came from different worlds, but our values aligned, our visions seemed to complement each other. And in those early days, as we began to spend more time together, I realized that Barack was becoming more than just a colleague, more than a friend. He was someone who challenged me, who saw the world through a lens I hadn't considered, who made me believe in the possibility of something greater than myself. Those early days at Sidley and Austin marked the beginning of a journey that would change both of our lives. We were two young Black professionals, each with our own dreams, our own paths. But together, we began to imagine a future that was bigger than either of us, a future that held the promise of something lasting, something meaningful. And in that moment, as we embarked on the journey of becoming us, I knew that this was only the beginning. As Barack and I grew closer, our lives began to intertwine in ways that neither of us had anticipated. We were both young lawyers with big dreams, each carrying a different piece of the story of Black America. I had come from the South Side of Chicago, where my family's hard work was our foundation, where resilience and community defined us. Barack had come from Hawaii and Indonesia, places that seemed as far removed from the South Side as one could imagine. Yet, in our conversations, in the hours we spent talking about everything from politics to our favorite music, we found common ground, a shared vision that brought us together. Dating Barack was not like anything I'd experienced before. He had this way of seeing the world that was both idealistic and intensely practical, and that combination intrigued me. Barack wasn't interested in what others thought he should do. He was focused on what he felt was right, what he believed was worth dedicating his life to. It was this clarity of purpose that drew me in, this sense that he was searching for something deeper, something meaningful, even as he navigated the often shallow waters of corporate law. I began to see his ambitions not just as lofty dreams, but as a reflection of his character, of his commitment to a greater good. He was trying to build a world that would include people like us, people who often had to fight for their place. Our relationship began slowly, quietly, growing with each late-night conversation and shared moment. After long days at Sidley and Austin, we'd find a quiet corner to talk, our words weaving a shared world, a space where we could be fully ourselves. On weekends, we'd walk through Chicago, talking about everything we saw, sharing our dreams, our frustrations, our hopes for what life could be. Sometimes, we'd stop for ice cream or sit by the lake, letting the calm of the water and the city's hum wrap around us. Those moments felt sacred, like they were building the foundation for something lasting. But our worlds were not without challenges. The more I learned about Barack, the more I realized just how deeply he was invested in his community work. He spoke passionately about the people he'd met as a community organizer, about the struggles and the hopes of families on the South Side, people who had been left out of the promises of progress. Barack's commitment was unwavering. He believed in change, believed in the power of people to shape their own futures if they were given the right tools, the right support. His idealism was infectious, but it also made me question whether I was doing enough, whether my role at Sidley and Austin was really aligned with what I wanted for myself. One of the things that brought us together was our mutual understanding of what it meant to be Black in America, though our experiences had been vastly different. Barack had grown up with a unique set of challenges, raised by his white grandparents in Hawaii, where he'd been an outsider, a young Black man in a world where he often felt alone. For me, the South Side had been a place of belonging, a community where I felt seen and valued. But outside of that bubble, I understood the barriers and the bias that came with being a Black woman in spaces that were not always welcoming. Together, we shared a sense of responsibility, a desire to make a difference, to bring about some kind of change that could help lift others up. One evening, as we walked through Jackson Park, Barack began sharing more about his vision. He spoke about wanting to make a tangible impact, about how he wanted to work on policies that would address poverty, education, and healthcare. He had a way of talking that made you feel like his dreams were not only possible, but inevitable. Barack's vision was so clear, so driven by a sense of justice that I felt myself questioning my own path. I had chosen corporate law because it was practical, because it was stable, a path that promised security. But with Barack, I started to wonder if there was something more, if I was capable of doing more. As our relationship deepened, I began to see the choices before me with a new lens. Barack challenged me, not in an overt way, but simply by being himself. He made me question whether I was living in alignment with my own values, whether I was truly fulfilled by the work I was doing. The cases I worked on at Sidley and Austin were important, of course, but they were also far removed from the community I came from the people who had shaped me. Barack's dedication to community work stirred something in me, a longing to reconnect with my own roots, to find a way to give back in a more meaningful way. One summer, Barack decided to return to Harvard to complete his law degree, and I faced the reality of a long-distance relationship. It was a test, a challenge that made me confront just how much he meant to me, just how deeply our lives had become intertwined. The days felt longer without him around, and I found myself missing not just his presence, but the way he made me think, the way he inspired me to look at the world differently. Our phone calls became my anchor, a way to stay connected, to keep building our shared dreams even from a distance. During that time, I began to think more seriously about my own career, about the direction I wanted my life to take. I wanted stability, yes, but I also wanted purpose, a sense of connection to something greater than myself. I started exploring options outside of corporate law, looking at roles that would allow me to work more directly with people, to make an impact in a way that felt real and tangible. It was a shift, a small but significant turning point in my journey, a step toward becoming someone who wasn't just successful, but fulfilled. When Barack returned, our relationship felt even stronger. The distance had tested us, and we had come through it with a deeper understanding of each other. We began to talk about our future, about the life we wanted to build together, a life rooted in service, in a commitment to something beyond our own ambitions. Barack's dream of public service, of making a real difference, became a shared vision, a blueprint for the life we hoped to create. We moved forward, not knowing exactly what the future held, but trusting that together, we could face whatever challenges came our way. Barack continued to work as a community organizer, and I eventually left Sidley and Austin to take a role in public service. It was a choice that felt both daunting and freeing, a decision that aligned my work with the values that Barack had helped me reconnect with. In those early days of our relationship, we weren't just two young professionals trying to make our way in the world. We were two people who believed in something bigger, who wanted to make a difference, who understood that our lives, our choices, could shape not only our future but the futures of those around us. We became a team, united by a shared sense of purpose, a shared vision of what could be. Barack's presence in my life was transformative, not because he changed who I was, but because he helped me see parts of myself that I had almost forgotten. He reminded me of my roots, of the community that had shaped me, of the importance of giving back. Together, we began to build a foundation that would carry us through the challenges and triumphs to come, a foundation built on love, on respect, and on a shared commitment to becoming the best versions of ourselves. This chapter in our lives was just the beginning, a time of learning, of growth, of laying the groundwork for a future that neither of us could have fully imagined. And as we moved forward, hand in hand, I knew that this journey was one that would shape us both, that would push us to keep becoming, not just as individuals, but as a team. With each new role I took on, I felt my path becoming clearer, shaped by a desire to make a difference and to stay rooted in my values. When I joined Public Allies, an organization dedicated to inspiring young people to pursue public service, I found an outlet that felt deeply aligned with my own experiences and aspirations. Public Allies focused on finding and nurturing young, diverse leaders, encouraging them to work within their communities for meaningful change. For me, it was a mission that resonated deeply. The work started with almost nothing, just a few contacts and a mission to build up a community program from scratch. I poured myself into the role, handling everything from finding office space to recruiting new allies. There was an energy in creating something new, a feeling that we were part of a larger story, something that could reshape our communities and give young people opportunities that had often been reserved for the privileged. Our first office was no fancy high-rise, but a modest space with second-hand furniture donated from corporate offices. Each piece, the desks, chairs, even the old office coffee pot, felt like a small victory. I wanted these young people, the allies, to have an environment that was theirs, where they could feel valued and empowered to contribute. Finding our allies became the most exciting part of the journey. Some were recent graduates with the potential to excel but had limited access to opportunities. Others were from nearby neighborhoods and had the kind of street smarts that couldn't be taught in any classroom. Each person brought a unique story, a perspective shaped by their own lives and experiences. My team and I scoured colleges, churches, and community centers, seeking out young people with the potential and the drive to make a difference, but who had lacked the opportunity. This work brought me back to my roots on the south side of Chicago, where I'd seen firsthand how much talent could go unnoticed, how quickly potential could be overshadowed by circumstance. Public allies gave me a renewed sense of purpose, a feeling that I was doing something truly meaningful. I wanted these young people to see themselves as capable, to realize that their voices mattered and that they could play a role in shaping their communities. Public allies didn't pay well, and that reality hit hard. I had grown used to a steady income as a corporate lawyer, but my values now outweighed financial security. I realized, too, that many who worked in nonprofit sectors had the privilege of family support or financial cushioning, advantages that allowed them to accept low-paying roles. I negotiated for a livable salary, aware that I couldn't contribute fully if I couldn't pay my bills. This negotiation felt liberating. It was a moment of standing up for myself, affirming that this work was worth real support, even if that wasn't the norm. Building public allies in Chicago was intense, but it was work that fulfilled me on a level I hadn't known before. Each day, I'd meet with young people full of potential, talking with them about their dreams, their visions for their communities. We matched them with organizations where they could make a real impact, and as they settled into their roles, I saw the transformation begin. Many of our allies entered the program unsure of what they could contribute or what their future might hold. Watching them grow, seeing their confidence build as they realized they could make a difference, was a gift. Throughout this time, Barack was my steadfast partner. We had both taken unconventional paths, he as a community organizer, me as a nonprofit leader, and these choices had come with sacrifices. We were balancing our own ambitions with our commitment to each other, finding a rhythm in our life together that felt grounded yet dynamic. At home, we supported each other, sharing our challenges and triumphs, cheering each other on. As public allies grew, we began to see the broader impact of our work. Some of the allies went on to leadership roles in community organizations. Others pursued careers in education, healthcare, or public service. The ripple effect of their work became visible across Chicago. Watching these young people take the skills they'd learned and bring them back to their communities was immensely satisfying. In those years, I learned that leadership was about more than title or authority. It was about empowering others, helping them see the strengths they already possessed. Building public allies was about opening doors for people who had often been overlooked. It was about finding power in community, in shared purpose, in the simple but transformative act of giving people a chance. As I look back on this chapter, I see how public allies not only shaped my professional life, but also grounded me more deeply in my commitment to service, a commitment that would only grow in the years to come. This was a time of growth, of learning to lead with integrity, and of becoming part of something larger than myself, a journey that was only just beginning. Becoming Us, Chapter 12. By this time, Barack and I had settled into a rhythm, though settled might be too strong a word. Our lives were busy, pulled in a dozen directions by work, ambitions, and responsibilities that seemed to multiply as we grew deeper into our careers. At Public Allies, I'd become a part of something I could believe in, working with young people from Chicago's neighborhoods who were full of talent, energy, and ideas. I'd watched them grow, finding purpose in roles that allowed them to see their own potential and make real contributions. Barack, meanwhile, had begun laying the groundwork for his own vision of public service. We were two people working towards separate goals, but somehow, our paths always came back together. Public Allies felt like a place where I could make a real difference. Every day, I saw young people, often those who'd been overlooked or underestimated, come into their own. They were counselors in after-school programs, community health advocates, organizers, and leaders who were learning the strength of their own voices. I was a mentor, a support system, guiding them as they navigated their roles, sometimes struggling but always moving forward. Watching them build confidence was powerful, and it gave me a sense of satisfaction I hadn't found anywhere else. Meanwhile, Barack's work as a community organizer continued to pull him in deeper. His commitment was unwavering, grounded in the neighborhoods where he felt his work could have the greatest impact. He wasn't just passing through these communities. He knew the people, the challenges, and the struggles they faced. Barack's heart was there, in every meeting, every speech he gave, each one calling for people to look beyond their own struggles and consider what could be accomplished together. It was a vision that was both idealistic and practical, and I knew he believed in it down to his core. Our conversations were different now. We'd always shared dreams, always been honest about what we wanted, but these days, those talks felt more real, the decisions more immediate. We talked about politics, about policy, about the ways that change could happen, not in grand gestures but through small, steady steps. Barack had been working on his book, Dreams from My Father, his story about growing up as a biracial child, about his family, and about the journey that had led him to community work. Writing was his way of making sense of it all, of the experiences and contradictions that had shaped his life. Watching him wrestle with his ideas, with the truth of his story, I could see how much it mattered to him to get it right. In those days, it was common to find him at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, deep in thought. He'd read passages aloud, asking for my feedback, his voice carrying a mix of reflection and intensity. The book was a mirror, a way for him to confront his own history. And as he read, I could feel the weight of those words, the way each one brought him closer to understanding himself. I watched him bring his past into focus, one story at a time, building a narrative that was as complex as it was honest. But as close as we were, there was no ignoring that our work came with sacrifices. Barack's community meetings often ran late, his commitments spilling over into evenings and weekends. I, too, found myself engulfed in my role at Public Allies, constantly balancing a workload that left me both exhausted and fulfilled. Our lives were driven by purpose, but that purpose sometimes pulled us in different directions. There were nights when I'd wait up for him, listening for the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, and I'd wonder how long we could keep up this pace. Some evenings, when we both managed to get home at a decent hour, we'd sit by the lake, letting the city lights shimmer on the water. There was a comfort in those quiet moments, in knowing that even amid all the busyness, we still found time to come together, to connect, to share the things that mattered most. In those conversations, I felt our bond grow stronger, rooted in a shared understanding that went beyond words. Barack's sense of purpose was contagious, but it also brought me face to face with my own questions. Watching him dedicate himself so fully to his community work made me wonder if I was doing enough, if my own path was as aligned with my values as his seemed to be. I found myself thinking more and more about what I wanted from my life, about the choices I was making and the impact I hoped to have. Public Allies was fulfilling, yes, but was it where I wanted to be? Was this the direction I wanted to take? These questions lingered, not in a way that demanded immediate answers, but as a gentle nudge, a reminder that life was about more than stability or routine. I knew that Barack was someone who would keep challenging me, who would keep pushing me to grow, to think beyond myself, to consider what else I might be capable of. Our love wasn't about finding someone to complete me. It was about finding someone who would push me to complete myself. As Barack's book neared completion, his thoughts turned toward his next steps, toward the possibilities that lay beyond community organizing. He'd started talking about law, about policy, about the ways he could make a difference on a larger scale. It was a natural progression for him, and I could see how his mind worked, how he was already envisioning the impact he wanted to have. There was a seriousness in his voice when he spoke about these things, a conviction that told me he was ready to go further, to explore the kind of public service that could bring about real, lasting change. And though the future felt uncertain, I knew that whatever path we chose, we would face it together. Becoming Us Chapter 13 by now, my relationship with Barack had become a steady presence, an anchor amid all the changes and decisions we were both facing. We had created a rhythm, finding moments to pause and reconnect despite the intensity of our work. Public Allies kept me deeply engaged, while Barack's focus on community organizing continued to evolve. He was thinking more and more about law and public service, about making an impact on a broader scale. The conversations we'd started in the early days of our relationship now felt bigger, more urgent. It was as though the world was pulling us forward, showing us glimpses of a future that was coming into view, even if it wasn't yet fully defined. Working with Public Allies had grounded me, giving me a front-row seat to the resilience and drive of young people from Chicago's neighborhoods. Every day, I saw them rise to the challenges we threw at them, developing leadership skills, growing more confident, and beginning to see themselves as capable of affecting change. These were kids who hadn't always had a chance, young people who were now finding ways to make their voices heard, whether through public service or grassroots initiatives. Seeing their growth reinforced my commitment to service and reminded me of why I'd chosen this path. It was about more than just a job, it was a calling. But even as I threw myself into the work, there was an awareness that my life was shifting. Barack's commitment to public service had started to take on a new dimension. He was considering a run for the Illinois State Senate, something he spoke about with a quiet but unshakable resolve. For him, it wasn't just about ambition. It was about impact, about bringing the stories of the people he'd worked with into the halls of power, about creating real change for communities like those on the South Side. Watching him prepare, I saw how much thought and care he poured into every decision. He'd spend hours reading, researching, thinking through the challenges, committed to understanding the issues before he even considered stepping forward. Our discussions took on a new tone. We talked about the responsibilities that came with public service, the sacrifices, the demands, and how these choices would affect our life together. Barack was clear-eyed about the challenges, but he was driven by something deeper, a belief that he could make a difference. I listened, sometimes with a sense of awe, other times with a quiet apprehension. His vision was bold, and though I believed in him, I knew that a life in public service was one that would require us both to be all in. There was no halfway with Barack. He did things with his whole heart, his entire being. Our days grew fuller, filled with late nights and early mornings, with strategy meetings and community events. Barack was becoming more visible in Chicago's political scene, speaking at rallies, meeting with community leaders, and connecting with people who believed in his vision for change. Watching him, I felt a mixture of pride and protectiveness. I knew that he was stepping into a world that could be both inspiring and brutal, a world that would scrutinize every part of him, that would hold him to a standard that was often impossible. But Barack was undeterred, focused on what mattered, his eyes set firmly on the goal. My role at Public Allies continued to grow, too. I was mentoring new cohorts, working with young people who were beginning their own journeys into public service, each one full of potential, full of the energy and optimism that made them see every challenge as surmountable. They came to me with questions, with doubts, with hopes, and it was my job to help them navigate this world, to see their own strengths, to believe in their power to make a difference. I loved this work, even on the hardest days, and it grounded me in a way that few things ever had. At home, our routines had shifted. Barack and I were building something together, a life that was full of purpose but also full of demands. Our time together was precious, marked by moments of laughter, by shared meals, by the comfort of knowing we had each other's backs. We leaned on each other, found strength in our connection, and trusted that whatever came next, we'd face it as a team. There were days when the future felt daunting, when the weight of our responsibilities seemed heavy, but we kept moving forward, guided by a shared vision. One night, as we sat at the kitchen table, Barack looked at me, his expression both serious and full of warmth. He told me that he wanted to marry me, that he wanted us to build a life together, not just in the abstract, but in the tangible, day-to-day sense. The words settled over me like a promise, and in that moment, I knew that this was where I was meant to be. Our lives were already intertwined, our futures linked in ways that felt both natural and profound. But his words gave it shape, made it real, and I felt a sense of calm, of certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them side by side. Our wedding was a celebration of that commitment, a day filled with the laughter and love of family and friends, a day that brought our worlds together in a way that felt almost magical. Standing beside Barack, surrounded by the people who had shaped us, who had believed in us, I felt a sense of joy that was both grounding and uplifting. This was the beginning of a new chapter, a step into a life that was rich with meaning, a life that we would build together, one choice at a time. As we took those first steps into married life, I knew that our journey would be anything but ordinary. We were both driven by a sense of purpose, by a desire to make a difference, and that path would be challenging. But I also knew that with Barack by my side, there was no obstacle we couldn't face, no dream that was out of reach. Together, we were ready to keep becoming. The first months of marriage felt like stepping into a new rhythm, one built on routines and a quiet certainty. Barack and I were now a team in the truest sense, sharing both the mundane aspects of life and the larger vision we held for the future. There was a deep comfort in knowing that no matter what challenges we faced, we'd face them together. We'd start our days with a certain ease, each of us going off to our respective worlds, knowing that at the end of the day, we'd return home to each other. Barack's schedule kept getting busier, and I could see that the demands on his time and energy were growing. His work was intense, and he often found himself immersed in it long into the night, sometimes barely pausing to take a breath. He was passionate about making a difference, about the people and communities he served, and that dedication fueled him. I admired his commitment, but I also worried about the toll it was taking on him. Late into the night, I'd hear the sound of pages turning or the steady click of his laptop keys, knowing that he was wrestling with ideas and plans that were bigger than either of us. We'd often sit together, sharing our thoughts, our dreams, and our worries. He'd talk about his vision for change, about the issues facing our community, and the ways he believed he could help. His words were thoughtful, measured, and filled with an urgency that reminded me of why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. Barack didn't just talk about change, he embodied it. He was willing to do the hard work, to push himself to find solutions that would lift others up. And as his partner, I found myself both inspired and challenged by his vision, knowing that his path would inevitably shape my own. Working with public allies continued to be a source of fulfillment for me. Each day, I saw young people discovering their own strengths, learning how to navigate the complexities of public service, and finding ways to make their voices heard. It was powerful to witness, and it gave me a sense of purpose that went beyond any title or paycheck. These were young people who had often been overlooked or underestimated, yet here they were, stepping into leadership roles, making a difference in their communities. Watching them grow reminded me of my own journey, of the ways I had been shaped by mentors and teachers who believed in me, who saw potential where others might have missed it. At home, life was simple but satisfying. We had our routines, our shared meals, our quiet evenings spent catching up on each other's days. There was something deeply grounding about those moments, the sense of normalcy that came from simply being together. We didn't have a lot of money or fancy things, but we had each other, and that was more than enough. I found joy in the small things, the way Barack would surprise me with a favorite snack, or how we'd spend hours talking about everything from politics to our favorite books. But beneath the surface, there was a growing awareness that Barack's path was leading him towards something bigger. He'd started talking about the possibility of running for office, a thought that was both exciting and daunting. The idea of him holding public office was inspiring, but it also meant stepping into a world that would require sacrifices, not just from him, but from both of us. We'd talked about public service, about the ways we wanted to make a difference, but now those conversations were taking on a new level of reality. It wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a decision that would impact our lives in ways we couldn't fully predict. Barack's potential run for state office became a regular topic of discussion. We'd go back and forth, weighing the pros and cons, considering what this would mean for our future. He'd speak about the issues he wanted to address, the changes he hoped to bring about, and I could see the spark in his eyes, the passion that drove him. But I also knew that a life in politics was one that came with challenges that would test us as a couple, that would demand resilience and patience in ways we hadn't yet experienced. In the quiet moments, I'd think about what it would mean to share my life with someone whose work would be in the public eye, whose every decision would be scrutinized, praised, or criticized. It was a reality that felt both thrilling and intimidating, and I found myself grappling with the idea of a life that would no longer be entirely our own. There were moments of doubt, moments when I questioned whether I was ready for this, whether I could handle the pressure, the demands, the sacrifices that came with a life in public service. But in those moments, I'd look at Barack and see the strength and clarity in his gaze, the unwavering belief in his purpose, and it would give me the reassurance I needed. Around this time, Barack's work became even more demanding, with community meetings, events, and speaking engagements that seemed to fill every corner of his schedule. He was becoming more visible in Chicago's political landscape, connecting with people who believed in his vision, who saw in him a leader they could trust. Watching him speak, watching the way people responded to him, I felt a mixture of pride and protectiveness. I knew that this was his calling, that he was doing exactly what he was meant to do, but I also knew that the road ahead would be anything but easy. Our conversations took on a new depth, touching on the complexities of life in the public eye, the sacrifices that would be required, and the impact it would have on us as a couple. We were committed to each other, to building a life together, but we both understood that this path would test us in ways we couldn't yet imagine. There were days when the weight of it all felt heavy, when the responsibilities seemed overwhelming, but we leaned on each other, finding strength in our partnership. One evening, after a long day of meetings and events, Barack sat me down and shared his thoughts about the future. He spoke about his desire to serve, about the changes he wanted to bring to our community, about the ways he believed he could make a difference. His words were filled with a quiet conviction, a sense of purpose that was both inspiring and humbling. I listened, feeling the depth of his commitment, knowing that this was more than just a career move for him. It was a calling, a way to use his gifts in service of others. In that moment, I understood that we were stepping into a new chapter, a chapter that would require us to be all in, to give everything we had to this journey. It wasn't just about Barack's ambitions or my work at Public Allies. It was about something larger, a shared vision of a future that was built on service, on a commitment to lifting others up. And as we took that step together, I felt a sense of calm, a quiet certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them side by side as partners, as a team. In the months leading up to the Illinois State Senate election, our lives took on a new, more intense rhythm. Every day felt full and charged with purpose. Barack's campaign was in full swing, and it demanded everything he had: early mornings, late nights, and constant movement across neighborhoods, meeting people, and learning firsthand about their challenges and hopes. I could see that he was pouring his whole self into this effort, and I admired his dedication, even as I felt the weight of the sacrifices we were both making. Our home life, simple and fulfilling as it had been, now adjusted to fit the whirlwind of the campaign. Dinners often turned into strategy sessions, with Barack sharing stories of the people he'd met, their stories lighting a fire in his resolve. He'd talk about the mother balancing 2 jobs just to get by, the young man facing limited options because of a broken school system, or the elder who'd lived through decades of change but still struggled with everyday necessities. These stories became fuel for him, and he carried them with him in every conversation, every debate. Watching him connect with the people he aimed to serve, I felt a mixture of pride and a fierce protectiveness. Meanwhile, my work at Public Allies continued to ground me, even as I felt the increasing weight of Barack's campaign. Each day, I worked with young people who were discovering their strengths and potential, learning to become leaders in their own right. Their energy was a reminder of the power of community, of what could be accomplished when people believed in themselves and each other. These young allies were as driven and hopeful as Barack, and they reminded me why we both cared so much about service. Evenings together became fewer as Barack's campaign events kept him on the go, sometimes from dawn until late at night. Our time together grew even more precious, and we found small ways to stay connected, to keep each other grounded. Late at night, after a long day of work and campaign events, we'd sit down with a cup of tea, catching up on each other's days, sharing both the triumphs and the challenges. These quiet moments were like an anchor, a reminder that amid all the demands and expectations, we had each other. But there was no denying that the campaign brought new pressures. There were times when I missed the simplicity of our early days, when our lives weren't as tied to public responsibilities. And yet, I understood that this was Barack's calling, that he was driven by a sense of purpose that was unwavering. I could see that he believed deeply in the difference he could make, and that belief kept him moving forward, even when the journey was tough. As Election Day approached, our lives became an even more intense blur of meetings, events, and last-minute preparations. Barack was relentless, pushing himself to connect with as many people as possible, to hear their stories, to show them that he cared. His determination was inspiring, and I found myself both uplifted and challenged by his drive. Watching him, I knew that a life in public service would be demanding, but I also knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. On election night, we gathered with friends, family, and supporters, everyone holding their breath as the results started coming in. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, each of us hoping for the outcome we'd worked so hard to achieve. When the announcement finally came that Barack had won, the room erupted in cheers, the energy and joy almost overwhelming. It was a victory not just for him, but for everyone who had believed in his vision, for everyone who had been part of the journey. And in that moment, as we celebrated together, I felt a surge of pride and gratitude, knowing that he had achieved something truly meaningful. The days that followed were a mix of celebration and reflection. Barack was already looking ahead, thinking about the work he wanted to do, the changes he hoped to bring about. His mind was filled with ideas and plans, and I could see that he was eager to get started, to begin making a difference. But as we stepped into this new chapter, I also felt the quiet weight of responsibility, the knowledge that our lives would now be intertwined with the demands of public service. Our conversations took on a new depth, touching on the realities of a life in the public eye, the sacrifices that would be required, and the impact it would have on us as a couple. There were moments of doubt, moments when I wondered how we would balance our personal lives with the responsibilities of public life. But each time, we returned to the shared values that had brought us together, the commitment to something greater than ourselves. And in that commitment, I found strength, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, side by side, with a purpose that was clear and unshakable. The year following Barack's Senate victory was marked by shifts, both subtle and seismic, that transformed the rhythm of our lives in ways we hadn't fully anticipated. His new role as state senator brought with it a level of responsibility, visibility, and scrutiny that neither of us had quite prepared for. Barack was no longer just a voice in the community or a respected organizer. He was now representing thousands of people, carrying their hopes, needs, and expectations with him to the Illinois state capitol. I watched him shoulder this responsibility with his characteristic calm, diving into his work with intensity and focus, determined to understand every aspect of his role. But with his new title came a reality that meant more time apart and a growing tension in the balance between our shared life and his public commitments. When he left for Springfield, the seat of Illinois government, several days each week, I was left to carry on in Chicago, managing my work with public allies while adjusting to the ever-changing landscape of our private life intersecting with the public eye. Springfield wasn't far, but it might as well have been a world away. The nature of his work was demanding, pulling him into the core of Illinois politics, where long legislative sessions and late-night policy discussions filled his days and often his evenings. He'd come home exhausted but also energized, eager to share his thoughts on the issues he was tackling: education reform, healthcare access, economic opportunity. He'd talk with a kind of hope and urgency, describing the moments when he felt he could actually make a difference and the struggles that came with pushing against entrenched systems. I loved seeing him this way, so driven and alive with purpose. But there was also a lingering ache, a sense that the life we were building together was constantly adjusting, stretching to accommodate his growing responsibilities. Back in Chicago, my role at Public Allies kept me busy, grounding me amid the changes that were sweeping through our personal lives. Working with young people who were stepping into leadership roles, discovering their potential, was deeply fulfilling. They reminded me of the power of service, of the importance of community, and of the resilience needed to bring about change. Yet, in the background, I felt a shifting weight, the growing demands of being a politician's wife, a role I'd never envisioned for myself. Invitations to events, appearances, and community functions began to fill my calendar, and with each one, I became more aware of the expectations that came with our new reality. People wanted to know who I was, what I stood for, and how I fit into Barack's world. I found myself grappling with questions of identity, wondering how I could remain true to myself amid the growing expectations placed upon me. Weekends became sacred, an escape from the constant push and pull of public life. When Barack returned from Springfield, we'd carve out time to reconnect, finding solace in each other's company. Our walks along the lake became a ritual, a way to talk without distractions, to be just Michelle and Barack, rather than Senator and Mrs. Obama. We'd share stories from our week, laughing at small mishaps and finding comfort in familiar routines. It was during these moments that I was reminded of the strength of our bond, the foundation we had built long before the titles, the responsibilities, or the public gaze. Barack's presence in the Senate was transformative, not just for him, but for those he represented. I saw him become more assured, more attuned to the issues that mattered most to the people of Illinois. His passion for topics like education reform, healthcare, and economic equality deepened with each interaction, each conversation with a constituent who shared their story. He'd come home and recount these conversations, his face lighting up as he spoke of the people he'd met, their hopes and dreams adding fuel to his determination. But I also saw the toll it took on him, the late nights, the frustrations that came from facing obstacles, the weight of responsibility that seemed to settle on his shoulders more heavily each day. In quieter moments, I'd find myself alone, reflecting on this journey we were on the life we were building that was now so intertwined with public service. I felt proud of Barack and all that he was achieving, but I couldn't ignore the growing awareness of what this meant for our future. This was a path that required resilience, sacrifice, and a willingness to share more of ourselves with the world than I had ever imagined. There were nights when I lay awake, wondering how we would balance our personal dreams with the public responsibilities that were becoming a central part of our lives. It was a new reality, one that demanded strength, patience, and a level of commitment that I hadn't fully anticipated. As the months passed, I began to see our relationship as something more than just a partnership. We were becoming a team in the truest sense. We weren't just two individuals pursuing separate dreams. We were united by a shared purpose, a vision of a future built on service and the belief that we could make a difference. I leaned on Barack's strength, his unwavering dedication, and in return, he leaned on my support, my ability to keep us grounded. We were building something together, something that went beyond just us, something that had the potential to impact the lives of others. Our lives were far from easy, and the demands were often overwhelming. But in the moments when I felt the weight of it all, I'd remember why we had chosen this path. I'd think of the young people I worked with at Public Allies, the way they faced challenges with courage and hope, and it would give me the strength to keep going, to believe in the importance of what we were doing. And in those moments, I felt a sense of calm, a quiet certainty that we were on the right path, that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, side by side, bound by a love and a purpose that was unshakable. As I look back on my early school days, one memory stands out with unusual clarity. It's strange how certain moments crystallize in our minds, how they manage to mark us in ways we can't anticipate or even understand until years later. This memory is one of those, a single encounter that, on the surface, seems small and forgettable. Yet, even now, I can feel its impact, as if the lesson it carried etched itself somewhere deep within me. It was a typical first-grade day. We had been lined up for lunch, each of us shifting impatiently, lost in the simple fascinations of being 6. I was caught up in a light-hearted debate about the names of crayon colors, of all things, delighted by the absurdity of it, convinced that burnt sienna sounded more like a foreign place than an actual color. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, a fist flew toward my face. There was no warning, no reason I could see, just a sudden, swift pain that radiated through my cheek. A boy had punched me, his small hand making quick, shocking contact. I remember feeling the sting spread across my skin, my mind trying to make sense of what had just happened. For a brief moment, I stood there, stunned, unable to process the randomness of it all. Then, as the shock wore off, I felt the tears come, the natural response of any 6-year-old caught off guard by both pain and confusion. I ran home, clutching my cheek and feeling a rush of emotions, hurt, certainly, but more than that, I was perplexed. Why had he done it? What had prompted this boy, whom I hardly knew, to suddenly lash out like that? The world seemed a bit more chaotic and unpredictable in that instant. At home, I found my mother, her familiar presence a balm for the shock I was feeling. She took one look at me and, with a calmness I would come to understand as her own unique brand of strength, asked me what had happened. I poured out the story in fragments, describing the boy and the punch, the feeling of surprise and hurt that had washed over me. My mother listened carefully, her eyes never leaving mine. She didn't interrupt or rush to judgment. She simply listened, absorbing every word, every detail. Once I had finished, she did something that surprised me. She didn't immediately comfort me or tell me that everything was going to be all right. Instead, she stood up, put on her coat, and took my hand. Together, we walked back to my school. I felt a surge of relief, mixed with a sense of pride. My mother was going to take care of it. She was going to make things right. But she didn't storm into the school or demand to speak to the principal, as I half expected she might. Instead, she approached the situation with a kind of calm assurance that was somehow even more powerful. Once inside, she spoke quietly to my teacher, asking questions and listening just as she had listened to me. She didn't accuse or raise her voice. She simply wanted to understand. I watched her, feeling a mix of awe and security, realizing that my mother's strength didn't lie in loud words or grand gestures. It was in her steadiness, in her ability to face challenges with a quiet grace that was unshakable. She was there for me in that moment, in the way that mattered most, not by fighting my battles for me, but by showing me how to face them with dignity and resilience. This memory became a touchstone for me, a reference point in the years that followed. It was a small event, barely noteworthy on the surface, yet it stayed with me, shaping my understanding of strength and courage. My mother hadn't taught me resilience by telling me to be strong or by insisting that I stand up for myself. She had taught it by example, by showing me what it looked like to handle adversity with grace. Her actions spoke louder than any words could have, leaving a mark that would guide me through many of life's challenges. As I grew older, there would be countless moments when life threw its own punches, some expected, others coming out of nowhere, just like that boy's fist. I would face criticism, judgment, and the kind of scrutiny that most people could never imagine. There would be days when I felt the sting of harsh words, the weight of expectations, the relentless pressure to be perfect. And in those moments, I would think back to that day, to the way my mother had handled that small crisis with a calm strength that was both reassuring and empowering. She had taught me that true resilience wasn't about being invincible. It was about being able to face whatever came my way with grace and determination. This lesson became especially important as I stepped into the public eye, a place where every move, every word, every choice was examined under a microscope. There were days when I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me, when the expectations and the criticisms seemed overwhelming. But each time, I would remember my mother's example, the way she had shown me that strength wasn't about shouting or making a scene. It was about being grounded, about knowing who I was and holding on to that, no matter what others might say. Even now, I carry that memory with me, a reminder of the quiet strength that has guided me through so much of my life. It's a strength that I see in my own daughters, in the way they navigate their own challenges and face their own fears. I hope that, in some small way, I have passed on to them the lesson my mother taught me, that resilience isn't about never being hurt or never making mistakes. It's about being able to pick yourself up, to keep going, even when the path is difficult. It's about facing life's challenges with grace and courage, knowing that you are strong enough to handle whatever comes your way. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, the air around me seemed alive with the sounds of striving. It wasn't the polished notes of a symphony or the familiar hum of a popular song. It was the steady, imperfect plunking of piano keys drifting up from my great-aunt Robbie's apartment below us. Robbie was the neighborhood's most formidable piano teacher, and in our tight-knit family, she was known for her high expectations and unyielding standards. She had a presence that commanded attention, a blend of authority and discipline that could make any child's hand tremble over the keys. I would sit quietly, often with my ear pressed against the floor, listening to the scattered notes as each student tried and failed, over and over again. "Find middle C," she would demand, her voice sharp, echoing through the thin walls of our apartment. My childhood was punctuated by these sounds, the hesitant, tentative notes, the inevitable mistakes, and her unwavering corrections. To anyone else, this might have seemed like noise, but to me, it was something more. It was the sound of people trying, of persistence in its rawest form. This imperfect music, this daily dedication to getting something right, would become a foundation of my own understanding of resilience and growth. Robbie was my mother's aunt, but she was more like a stern grandmother to me. With her, there were no shortcuts, no easy praise. If you wanted to earn her approval, you had to work for it, and even then, it was given sparingly. She was the kind of woman who would make you feel that every note you played mattered, that every stumble was an opportunity to try harder, to get better. To my young mind, she was both awe-inspiring and a little terrifying. I hadn't started taking lessons yet, but I was already intimidated by her. I remember the day I finally told my mother that I wanted to learn piano. I'd been listening to the older kids practicing downstairs, and I had convinced myself that I already knew enough to impress Robbie. After all, hadn't I absorbed every note, every rhythm, every mistake through the floorboards? I was certain that once I sat down at the piano, it would all come naturally, as if by magic. But magic didn't come easily with Robbie. At my first lesson, she handed me a beginner's workbook, showed me how to place my hands on the keys, and gave me a look that said she wouldn't tolerate anything less than my best effort. "Find middle C," she ordered, her finger hovering over the ivory keys. I remember the weight of that moment, the feeling that I was standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. The lessons that followed were grueling, a test of patience and persistence. Robbie's method was slow and meticulous. She wouldn't let me move on to a new song until I had mastered every note of the one I was working on. I would sit there, my feet dangling from the bench, my fingers straining to stretch across the keys, determined to make her proud. But no matter how hard I tried, she would find something to correct, a missed note, a fumbled rhythm. It was frustrating, and there were days when I wanted to give up, when I thought I would never live up to her standards. But each time, I would come back, ready to try again, ready to face her unyielding expectations. There was something in that struggle that I found oddly comforting. Maybe it was the structure, the discipline, the feeling that if I just worked hard enough, I could eventually get it right. In a way, those lessons were a mirror of my own life, an ongoing process of trial and error, of learning and growing, of striving towards something better. My family, too, was a world of its own, filled with its own unique rhythms and melodies. My father, Fraser, was a city worker, a man who had spent his life building things with his hands. He was quiet, steady, a man of few words but boundless warmth. He would come home from work each day, tired but smiling, his blue uniform dusted with the residue of a long day's labor. My mother, Marion, was the heart of our family, a woman of fierce intelligence and a gentle spirit. She had a way of making everything feel safe, of turning our small, crowded apartment into a haven. Our neighborhood was a mix of everything, different races, different cultures, different stories. I grew up surrounded by a sense of community, a feeling that we were all in this together, navigating the challenges and joys of life side by side. Our block was filled with families who had come to Chicago in search of a better life, people who worked hard and dreamed big. It was a place where everyone knew each other, where we looked out for one another, where the bonds of friendship and family ran deep. In the evenings after dinner, my father would sit in his recliner, his eyes fixed on the Cubs game on TV. I would curl up next to him, listening as he explained the rules of the game, his voice a steady, comforting presence. It was in these moments that I felt most connected to him, most aware of the quiet strength that he carried within him. He was a man who faced life's challenges with grace and resilience, a man who believed in the power of hard work and the importance of kindness. But there was another side to my father, a side that he didn't often show. Behind his easygoing smile and gentle demeanor, there was a quiet pain, a struggle that he kept hidden from us. My father had multiple sclerosis, a disease that gradually robbed him of his mobility, that forced him to confront his own limitations in ways that none of us could fully understand. But he never complained, never let it define him. He faced each day with courage, with a determination to keep moving forward, to keep living his life to the fullest. As a child, I didn't fully grasp the weight of what he was going through. I just knew that he walked a little slower than other dads, that he sometimes had to rest before climbing a flight of stairs, that he used a cane to steady himself. I knew that he was different, but I didn't see it as a weakness. To me, he was the strongest man in the world, a man who could face any challenge with a smile and a steady hand. His strength became a part of my own, a lesson that I would carry with me throughout my life. In many ways, my childhood was a series of small, quiet lessons in resilience. It was in the sound of piano notes drifting up from Robbie's apartment, in the steady rhythm of my father's footsteps, in the warmth of my mother's smile. It was in the everyday moments, the small acts of kindness and strength that shaped me, that taught me what it meant to be strong, to keep going, to face life with courage and grace. Looking back, I can see how each of these moments, each of these lessons became a part of me, a part of the woman I would become. They were the foundation upon which I built my life, the values that guided me through the challenges and triumphs of adulthood. They taught me to believe in myself, to trust in my own strength, to never give up, no matter how difficult the road ahead might seem. As I grew older, these lessons would take on new meaning, becoming a source of comfort and inspiration in times of doubt and uncertainty. They would remind me of where I came from, of the people who had shaped me, of the strength and resilience that ran through my veins. They would become a part of my story, a story that was still unfolding, that was filled with both struggle and joy, both hardship and hope. In the end, I think that's what resilience is all about. It's not about being invincible or unbreakable. It's about being willing to face life's challenges with an open heart and a steady hand, to keep moving forward, even when the road ahead is uncertain. It's about finding strength in the people we love, in the memories we carry, in the lessons we learn along the way. And so, as I look back on those early years, I feel a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the family who loved me, for the neighborhood that shaped me, for the challenges that taught me to be strong. Gratitude for the sound of piano notes drifting through the walls, for the steady rhythm of my father's footsteps, for the warmth of my mother's smile. These are the things that made me who I am, that gave me the courage to dream, to strive, to become more. My life, in many ways, has been a journey of becoming. It's been a journey of discovering who I am, of finding my voice, of learning to stand tall in a world that doesn't always make it easy. It's been a journey of growth and change, of struggle and triumph, of love and resilience. And through it all, I've been guided by the lessons of my childhood, by the strength and wisdom of the people who came before me. In the quiet moments, in the stillness of the night, I sometimes find myself thinking back to those early years, to the sounds and sights that filled my world, to the lessons that shaped my life. I think of Robbie, of her unyielding standards and her sharp, demanding voice. I think of my father, of his gentle strength and quiet courage. I think of my mother, of her warmth and kindness, of the way she made everything feel safe. These are the memories that ground me, that remind me of where I come from, of the journey that lies behind me, and of the journey that still lies ahead. In those moments, I feel a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that I am exactly where I am meant to be, that I am exactly who I am meant to be. And I know that, no matter what challenges come my way, I have the strength to face them, to keep moving forward, to keep becoming. Because in the end, that's what life is all about, becoming more, becoming better, becoming everything that we are meant to be.
In this section, Becoming More, Michelle Obama delves into the journey beyond her individual dreams and ambitions, exploring what it means to grow not only in public life, but also as a mother, a leader, and a symbol of hope for many. The transition into Becoming More represents a shift from personal development to stepping into a role that would impact countless lives. Here, we see her embracing responsibilities that stretch far beyond her own world, facing both the demands of motherhood and the complexities of being a public figure as Barack's career reaches the national stage. This part of her story is about embracing the journey of evolving while staying grounded, about using her voice and influence in ways that resonate with others. She begins to shape a new vision, one that involves not just personal growth, but the pursuit of inspiring and uplifting others, all while navigating the challenges that come with life on the global stage. Entering the phase of Becoming More brought a shift that felt as profound as it was challenging. My role as wife, mother, and now the partner of a U.S. Senator had evolved quickly, expanding with new expectations that seemed to grow daily. Life had taken on a whole new level of complexity. I was now balancing the intense demands of being a mother to two young daughters with the public-facing responsibilities that came with Barack's position and increasing visibility. Our lives, once filled with Chicago's familiar rhythms, had become more unpredictable, marked by travel, public appearances, and a growing awareness that our family was no longer just ours. People knew us now. Strangers on the street who recognized Barack from television, neighbors who would stop me in the grocery store to ask how he was doing. Each day brought a reminder that our lives were gradually becoming more public. When Barack announced his candidacy for the U.S. Senate, we knew it would be a challenge, yet neither of us could have fully anticipated the intensity of what lay ahead. Campaigning on a statewide level meant Barack was constantly on the move, traveling to every corner of Illinois, from bustling city neighborhoods to the quiet towns and farmlands. His commitment was unwavering. He was deeply focused on his vision, determined to reach as many people as possible, to listen to them, understand their stories, and share his ideas for positive change. In the midst of this, I was determined to keep life steady and grounded for our daughters, Malia and Sasha. They were still young, with lives centered around playdates, preschool, and bedtime stories. They didn't understand the scope of their father's work, nor did I want them to feel the weight of it. So, I made it my mission to create a sense of normalcy at home. I wanted them to feel safe and secure, to know that no matter what else was happening outside our door, they could count on home being a place of calm and routine. But achieving that balance was far from easy. I was now the one managing our home life solo most of the time, juggling work, parenting, and the realities of a public life that often felt like a balancing act. I'd find myself at the grocery store with Sasha on one hip and Malia holding my hand, running errands in between work calls and making sure they felt loved and heard. There were nights when I'd put the girls to bed alone, sometimes reading them a story or singing a lullaby, trying my best to fill the absence of Barack's steady presence. And while I was happy to support him, there were moments when the weight of it all felt overwhelming, when I wondered how long we could keep up this pace without losing a part of ourselves in the process. In this whirlwind of responsibilities, I leaned on my mother, who was my rock and my anchor. She was there whenever I needed her, providing wisdom, strength, and a steady hand. Her calm presence reminded me that I didn't have to do it all alone, that there was help and love surrounding me. She would take the girls for a few hours when I needed a break, or she'd come over to cook a meal and sit with me, allowing me to share my worries and hopes. Her support was invaluable, a reminder that no matter how demanding life became, family was a foundation that kept us grounded. The campaign itself was relentless, with demands that seemed to multiply as election day drew closer. Barack would come home from long days on the road, his eyes tired yet filled with the stories he'd heard, the people he'd met who fueled his commitment. He'd share tales of farmers struggling to make ends meet, of single mothers working multiple jobs to provide for their children, of young people yearning for a chance at a better future. Listening to him, I was reminded of why he had chosen this path, why he believed so deeply in the possibility of change. It was these stories, these lives, that kept him going, even when the journey felt exhausting. But as the campaign picked up speed, so did the scrutiny. Media outlets began to pay attention, digging into every aspect of Barack's life and, by extension, our family. I felt a growing sense of protectiveness over our daughters, a need to shield them from the outside world that was beginning to encroach on our private lives. I wanted to guard their innocence, to keep them from feeling the weight of the expectations and the constant gaze that now followed us. I made it my mission to keep things simple for them, to let them live as close to a normal childhood as possible. When Barack wasn't campaigning, he was working in the Senate, and it felt as though our time together was slipping away, piece by piece. Our conversations were often brief, squeezed into the small windows of time we managed to find, our words filled with the urgency of catching up. We discussed the logistics of family life, the details of the campaign, our hopes and fears for what lay ahead. In those moments, I felt a profound sense of connection, a reminder that despite the distance and the demands, we were still partners, still a team facing this journey together. Then there were the public events where I was asked to stand by Barack's side, to speak to crowds and shake hands with strangers who wanted a glimpse into our lives. I wasn't naturally inclined to public speaking. I preferred the quieter, private aspects of life. But I knew that this was part of the role, part of the commitment I had made. So I stepped up, finding my own voice, learning to share my story, our story, in a way that felt authentic and true. I wanted people to understand that we were just like them, facing the same challenges, the same worries, and the same dreams. Through it all, I found strength in the small routines that kept our family grounded. I made it a priority to sit down for dinner with Malia and Sasha each evening, creating a sense of continuity and connection amid the chaos. We'd talk about their day, share stories, laugh, and sometimes they'd ask about their father, wondering when he'd be home. I'd answer as best as I could, reassuring them that he was doing important work, that he loved them and would be home soon. But there were nights when the absence felt heavy, when I missed the simplicity of our early days together, when our lives hadn't yet been shaped by the demands of public service. And in those moments, I'd remind myself why we were doing this, why it mattered. I'd think about the young people I work with at Public Allies, about their hopes and dreams, and it would renew my sense of purpose, my commitment to this journey. The campaign came to a close in a moment of celebration and relief. Barack had won the election, and we were grateful for the support for the people who had believed in his vision. But I knew deep down that this was only the beginning, that our lives would continue to grow and evolve in ways that I could not yet fully imagine. We were stepping into a future that held both promise and uncertainty, a future that would demand more from us as individuals, as partners, and as a family. In the quiet after the victory, as we took a moment to reflect, I felt a sense of calm. We were on a path that was bigger than us, a journey that would challenge us and shape us in ways we hadn't yet experienced. And as I looked at Barack, I knew that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together, with resilience, love, and a commitment to becoming more. In the months after Barack's victory, life moved at an even faster pace. The celebration was short-lived. Within days, the reality of his new position came rushing in with all its demands. As a U.S. Senator, Barack was now juggling the responsibilities of representing millions, traveling between Chicago and Washington, and adapting to the life of a national figure. This meant more time apart, more adjustments, and the need for even more resilience. I quickly realized that his win in the Senate had only been the beginning, a small milestone in a journey that was taking on a new dimension with each passing day. Barack's days were now spent in Washington, where his focus was on understanding the intricacies of policy and governance. He was deeply engaged in conversations about healthcare, education reform, economic opportunity, and social justice. These were issues close to his heart, and he approached them with a sincerity that I admired. However, this also meant he was often physically absent, and I was left to hold down the fort in Chicago. The distance between us felt more pronounced than ever, stretching across state lines, with our routine splintered into separate lives that intersected only in fleeting moments. Our daughters, Malia and Sasha, were still young and unaware of the larger context surrounding their father's work. To them, Barack's absence was simple. Daddy was away for work. They missed him, and I did my best to explain why he was gone so often. I'd tell them stories of how he was working to help people, that he was trying to make life better for other families, just as he cared about ours. But as much as I reassured them, I felt the strain of single-handedly managing our home life, shouldering the responsibilities of parenting and household tasks on my own. Despite the challenges, I was determined to create a sense of stability and routine for Malia and Sasha. Every morning, I wake up early to make them breakfast, packing lunches, and ensuring they felt as if nothing had changed. Our evenings were sacred, dedicated to dinner together, followed by bedtime stories and quiet conversations. I wanted them to feel grounded, to know that even if one parent was away, they were still loved and supported. And while I cherished these moments, there were nights when I felt the loneliness creep in, a subtle ache that reminded me of the weight I was carrying alone. Barack and I would talk on the phone whenever we could, trying to bridge the gap that distance had created. Our conversations were often brief, touching on the highlights of our days, sharing small details that kept us connected. He'd tell me about the debates on the Senate floor, the challenges he faced, and the people he was working to represent. I could sense his passion, his commitment to the work, and it made me proud. But there was also a part of me that missed the simplicity of our early days together, when we could talk without interruption, without the weight of responsibilities pulling us in different directions. My own work continued at Public Allies, where I was now more determined than ever to make an impact. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that, like Barack, I was contributing to something meaningful. Working with young people from diverse backgrounds, helping them discover their potential and find their voices, was deeply fulfilling. Their energy, optimism, and resilience reminded me of why we had chosen this path, why we believed in the power of service. Each day, I was inspired by their growth, by their commitment to making a difference, and it fueled my own sense of purpose. As Barack's time in the Senate continued, his role and influence began to grow. He was invited to speak at events across the country, each one drawing more attention, more curiosity about this young senator from Illinois. With each speech, each appearance, Barack's profile rose, and I could feel our lives shifting once again. The public's interest in him grew, and with it came new challenges, the constant presence of the media, the need for security, and the awareness that our family was no longer just ours. People recognized us now, stopped us on the street, asked for pictures and autographs. It was strange, this new layer of visibility, and it made me protective of Malia and Sasha, determined to shield them from the spotlight that seemed to be closing in. One night, after Barack returned from a particularly intense week in Washington, we sat together, finally able to talk face to face. He shared his worries, his hopes, and the weight of the decisions he was facing. I listened, feeling both the pride and the strain that came with being his partner in this journey. He spoke about the people he'd met, the issues he was passionate about, and the impact he hoped to have. But as I listened, I sensed a restlessness in him, a feeling that perhaps there was more he could do, that the work he was doing now was only the beginning. It was during this time that Barack began to contemplate a possible run for the presidency. The idea was daunting, surreal even, but it was a thought that he couldn't shake. He believed that with the right leadership, real change was possible, that the challenges facing the country could be addressed with compassion, intelligence, and a commitment to unity. Yet, the magnitude of such a decision weighed heavily on both of us. We knew that a presidential campaign would be a life-altering commitment, one that would affect not just us, but our daughters, our families, and our sense of normalcy. As we discussed the possibility, my mind raced with questions and concerns. I thought about the scrutiny we'd face, the sacrifices we'd have to make, and the impact it would have on Malia and Sasha. I worried about how a life in the White House, if it came to that, would affect them, how they would cope with the constant attention and the lack of privacy. But despite my fears, I saw in Barack a sense of purpose that was undeniable. He believed in this path, believed that he could make a difference, and I knew that my role was to stand by him, to support him as he followed this calling. Our conversations became more frequent, more intense. As we weighed the decision together, we talked late into the night, exploring every angle, every consequence, trying to imagine what life would be like if he took this step. I felt the gravity of it, the responsibility, but I also felt a sense of calm. I trusted Barack, trusted his heart, his integrity, and his commitment to service. And in those quiet moments as we sat together, I realized that whatever happened, we would face it as a family, with resilience, love, and a shared commitment to the journey we were on. When Barack finally made the decision to run, it was with both excitement and a deep awareness of the journey that lay ahead. We knew that it wouldn't be easy, that it would require every ounce of strength, patience, and determination we had. But we were ready to step into a future that held both promise and uncertainty, a future that would demand more from us than we had ever imagined. In the months that followed, our lives transformed yet again, as the campaign took on a life of its own. The house became a hub of activity, with staff members, volunteers, and family members all working together toward a common goal. Our routines were upended, our sense of privacy diminished, but there was also a feeling of purpose, a sense that we were part of something larger than ourselves. And as we prepared for the road ahead, I felt a quiet strength within me, a certainty that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together as partners, as a family, and as a team. The moment Barack officially declared his candidacy for the presidency, our lives were irrevocably transformed. The decision to run had not been taken lightly. We knew it would be all-consuming, affecting not just Barack's life, but mine, our daughters, and the way we'd function as a family. I had experienced Barack's drive before, felt the depth of his dedication to public service. But this campaign was unlike anything we had ever faced. It was a leap into uncharted waters, and I could feel both the excitement and the enormity of it pressing down on us. Suddenly, our home in Chicago became a campaign headquarters of sorts. Every room was overtaken by piles of binders, strategy notes, and schedules. Staff members buzzed in and out. Phones rang constantly, and the hum of activity was relentless. There were volunteers dedicated to organizing rallies, advisors mapping out policy points, and a swarm of people handling the press, preparing statements and responses. It was a level of intensity that made our previous campaigns seem quiet by comparison. And with it came a constant awareness that this wasn't just any campaign. This was a bid for the White House. For Malia and Sasha, this change was both intriguing and confusing. They were still young, so they couldn't grasp the gravity of their father's campaign, but they could sense that life had shifted. There were more strangers around, more faces they didn't recognize, and the sense of privacy we'd tried so hard to maintain was beginning to erode. I found myself working even harder to create a sense of normalcy for them, carving out time for quiet moments together, reading bedtime stories, and keeping their routines as consistent as possible. I wanted them to feel safe, to know that despite the whirlwind around us, they could rely on the comfort and stability of our family life. On the campaign trail, Barack's days were filled with back-to-back events, speeches, town halls, and rallies. He'd travel from city to city, connecting with people from all walks of life, hearing their stories, their struggles, and their hopes for a better future. He poured himself into every interaction, listening intently, asking questions, and sharing his vision with an authenticity that resonated with people. Watching him speak, I saw a man fully committed to the ideals he believed in, someone who wasn't just running for office, but truly cared about the change he hoped to bring. But as much as I admired his dedication, I couldn't ignore the toll it was taking on him, and on us as a family. The campaign demanded more from me as well. I was now expected to be more than just a supportive spouse. The public wanted to know who I was, what I stood for, and how I could connect with them. My background, my career, my choices, everything was scrutinized, dissected, and discussed. The media's interest in me felt invasive, and there were moments when I struggled with the weight of it all. I wasn't naturally inclined toward public life. I preferred the quieter, more private aspects of supporting Barack. But now, I was being asked to step forward, to speak to crowds, to share my story and our family's story with strangers who were eager to understand us. I quickly realized that I had to find my own voice, to speak in a way that was true to who I was, rather than conforming to any preconceived notions of what a potential First Lady should be. I spoke openly about my background, about growing up on the south side of Chicago, about the values my parents had instilled in me, hard work, integrity, and compassion. I shared my journey through law school, my career choices, and my dedication to community work. And as I spoke, I found that people connected with my story, that they saw themselves in my experiences. It was empowering. This realization that I could be both authentically myself and an asset to Barack's campaign. With each event, each town hall, I became more comfortable in this new role, finding ways to balance the demands of the campaign with my responsibilities as a mother. I'd travel to different states, meet with people from all backgrounds, and listen to their stories. Their stories mirrored many of the experiences I'd seen growing up, the struggles, the hopes, the desire for a better future. In these moments, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder of why Barack and I had embarked on this journey together. But for every moment of inspiration, there was a counterweight of exhaustion and uncertainty. The media scrutiny was relentless, often harsh, with every detail of our lives dissected and sometimes misrepresented. I'd see headlines that questioned my choices, comments that misjudged my intentions, and narratives that painted a picture of us that felt unrecognizable. It was difficult not to feel the sting of those words, not to let them affect me. I worried about Malia and Sasha, about how this level of exposure would impact their lives, about how I could shield them from a world that was increasingly focused on our every move. When we were together as a family, I made it my mission to create a sense of refuge, a space where Barack, the girls, and I could be ourselves, away from the expectations and the noise. We'd have movie nights, cook meals together, and find solace in each other's company. These moments became our sanctuary, a reminder of who we were beneath the titles and the campaign slogans. But even these moments were fleeting, as Barack's schedule grew more demanding, pulling him back onto the road, back into the campaign. As the primary season heated up, the challenges intensified. Barack was gaining momentum, drawing larger crowds and garnering more support, but with that came heightened scrutiny from the media and our opponents. The criticisms became sharper, the expectations more extreme. I found myself caught between the desire to support him fully and the reality that this campaign was affecting every part of our lives. I worried about how long we could keep this up, about the toll it was taking on our daughters, on our relationship, and on our ability to live a life that felt genuine. Through it all, Barack and I leaned on each other, finding strength in our partnership. We'd talk late at night, discussing the highs and lows, the moments that felt like victories and the setbacks that felt crushing. In those conversations, I saw the depth of his commitment, the unwavering belief he had in what he was trying to achieve. And while the journey was challenging, It was in those quiet conversations that I felt the true meaning of partnership, that no matter how difficult the path, we were in this together, bound by a shared vision and an unshakable support for one another. The campaign was a journey that tested us in every way, that demanded more from us than we'd ever thought possible. It was a journey that exposed our strengths, our vulnerabilities, and our capacity to adapt. And as we moved forward, step by step, I found that I was becoming more resilient, more grounded in the knowledge that I could face these challenges, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. As election day drew closer, the anticipation grew, filling our lives with both hope and tension. We were on the cusp of something monumental, a possibility that felt both thrilling and terrifying. But whatever the outcome, I knew that we had given everything we had to this journey, that we had faced every challenge together, and that no matter what lay ahead, we would continue to move forward, committed to becoming more, for each other, for our family, and for the people who believed in us. By the time Barack officially became the Democratic nominee, the air around us felt charged with both hope and an intense pressure that neither of us had fully anticipated. We had made it through the primaries with their long nights, grueling travel schedules, and moments of doubt, but the real campaign, the final stretch toward the presidency, was just beginning. It felt monumental. We were on the brink of something unprecedented, and the weight of it all was as exhilarating as it was daunting. As the general election campaign unfolded, our home became a headquarters for all things political. The living room, dining room, and even parts of our bedroom overflowed with campaign materials, staff, advisors, and volunteers. People came and went, and I often found myself surrounded by a buzzing hive of activity, with strategists discussing numbers, policy experts refining platforms, and media coordinators preparing for the next big event. The house, once our private sanctuary, felt more like an extension of the campaign, with its own life and energy that seemed to never quiet. For Malia and Sasha, the transformation was particularly confusing. While they were still young enough to remain mostly sheltered from the intensity of it all, they could feel the shift in the air. I watched them adjust to the presence of strangers in our home, to the long absences of their father, and to the increasing attention from both friends and strangers alike. I did my best to protect them from the chaos, creating little pockets of normalcy within our new reality. We still had bedtime stories, family dinners, and weekend outings whenever possible. I clung to these moments as much as they did, feeling that they were our last remnants of a life that was once simpler. Every day brought new responsibilities. The demands of the campaign were relentless, with events scheduled back-to-back, speeches to prepare for, interviews to manage, and the constant presence of the media. Each public appearance required careful consideration, each statement had to be weighed, and every move was watched, analyzed, and critiqued. I learned quickly that nothing was off-limits. My background, my choices, even the way I spoke and dressed became topics of discussion. The scrutiny was intense, often harsh, and it forced me to confront my own vulnerabilities. One of the biggest challenges for me was finding my voice within the campaign. I wasn't just there to support Barack. People wanted to know who I was, what I stood for, and what role I would play if he became president. My speeches became an extension of my own values, shaped by my experiences growing up on the south side of Chicago, my education, my career, and the family values instilled in me by my parents. I talked about the importance of community, of opportunity, of resilience. I spoke honestly, often passionately, about the need for a country where every child could dream big and find the support to make those dreams a reality. And with each speech, I felt myself growing more comfortable in this new role, realizing that my story mattered, that it was part of what we were building together. While the campaign became more intense, my role as a mother remained at the forefront. Malia and Sasha were at a critical age, and I wanted to shield them from the parts of public life that could feel invasive and overwhelming. I worked hard to keep their lives as routine as possible, ensuring that they had friends, playdates, and family time that didn't revolve around politics. I wanted them to feel that they were still just kids, that their worth wasn't tied to their father's job or the outcome of the campaign. But as much as I tried to protect them, there were moments when the reality of our situation became impossible to ignore. During one particularly heated week, the press turned its attention toward me and my role in the campaign, questioning my past statements, analyzing my demeanor, and even speculating about what kind of first lady I would be. I could feel the weight of the public's expectations pressing down on me, and I worried about how these opinions might affect Malia and Sasha. They were too young to understand the complexities, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that one day they would read these articles, see these headlines, and wonder how the world saw their mother. It was a humbling experience, one that forced me to think deeply about who I was and who I wanted to be, not just for myself, but for my daughters and for the people who were looking to me for inspiration. Through all of this, Barack remained my source of strength. He was busier than ever, with speeches, debates, and constant travel. But in the quiet moments we shared, he would reassure me, reminding me of why we were doing this, of the bigger picture that extended beyond the campaign. He spoke about the people he wanted to help, the policies he hoped to implement, and the vision he had for a united, compassionate America. His words reminded me of the man I had fallen in love with, the man whose purpose went beyond himself, who believed deeply in the power of change. As Election Day approached, the anticipation grew, filling our lives with a mix of hope, fear, and determination. The country was watching, waiting to see if America was ready for a new direction, for a new kind of leadership. And we were waiting, too, knowing that whatever happened, our lives would be forever changed. The night before the election, Barack and I shared a moment of quiet reflection. We talked about the journey we had been on, the sacrifices, the growth, and the incredible support we had received from people across the nation. It was a moment filled with gratitude and a sense of calm, a reminder that we had done everything we could, that we had given our all to this journey. When Election Day finally arrived, the atmosphere was electric. We watched the results come in, surrounded by family, friends, and supporters, each of us holding our breath as the numbers began to reveal the outcome. And when the victory was announced, the room erupted in cheers, tears, and embraces. It was a moment that felt surreal, a dream made real, a vision brought to life. Barack had won, and in that moment, the weight of what lay ahead settled on us both. We knew that this victory was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that would bring challenges, responsibilities, and an even greater demand for resilience and unity. As we stood on stage that night, facing a crowd filled with hope and pride, I looked out and saw faces that mirrored my own emotions, joy, relief, and a fierce determination for the future. In that moment, I realized that our journey was no longer just ours. It belonged to everyone who had believed in us, who had dared to dream alongside us. It was a humbling and empowering realization, a reminder that the path we had chosen was about more than personal ambition. It was about building a future together, a future filled with possibility. In the days that followed, as the reality of our new life began to set in, I felt a sense of calm and purpose. The journey to the White House had been long, challenging, and transformative, and I knew that the path ahead would require every ounce of strength, patience, and courage we had. But I was ready. We were ready. Together, we had become more than we had ever imagined, and we were prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, committed to the promise of a brighter, more inclusive America. As Barack's campaign surged forward, we found ourselves swept into a life that was both exhilarating and exhausting. Every week brought a new state, a new crowd, a new story from someone hoping for change. Barack and I were both aware that our lives would never return to what they once were, even if he didn't win the presidency. We were already on a different path, one that demanded our fullest commitment and often more strength than we thought we had. There was no normal anymore, and with every step, the stakes seemed to grow. With Barack constantly on the move, my own role expanded further. I'd travel to swing states, meeting with supporters, talking to volunteers, and sharing our story at community gatherings. The crowds often surprised me with their warmth, their genuine interest in who we were, not just as public figures, but as a family navigating an extraordinary journey. I'd speak about my upbringing, about our girls, about the values that had carried us this far. And in doing so, I found that I was building connections of my own, creating a space where people felt seen and heard. Campaign life, however, was a balancing act. While Barack was out in front, meeting thousands of new faces and delivering speeches, I was constantly working to keep our daughters' lives as normal as possible. It was no small feat, especially as the media scrutiny intensified. By now, they were beginning to realize that life with a presidential candidate as a father meant living under a microscope. Reporters followed us. Cameras flashed at every turn, and privacy became a rare commodity. My focus was on shielding Malia and Sasha from the public eye as much as possible, creating pockets of normalcy amidst the storm of attention. Mornings became the calmest part of our day. I'd wake up early to make breakfast, sitting with the girls before the world's demands rushed in. We'd talk about school, laugh over cartoons, and savor the simplicity of those moments. It was a time for them to just be kids, and for me to be their mom, undistracted and present. No matter how far away Barack was, I'd remind them that their father loved them deeply, that he was doing this work for them, for their future. But even as I reassured them, I wondered if they could truly understand the magnitude of this journey and the sacrifices it required from all of us. My own role in the campaign brought new challenges as well. I was increasingly visible, no longer just supporting Barack from behind the scenes, but speaking to thousands of people at rallies, often in cities and states I'd never visited before. I'd step up to the podium, feeling a mixture of nerves and purpose, knowing that my words mattered, that people were listening, and looking to me for reassurance, for a sense of connection. I shared stories from our lives, spoke about the values that had shaped us, and conveyed my belief in Barack's vision for a better future. I wanted people to know that this journey wasn't just a political one. It was deeply personal, rooted in our shared hopes for a country that lifted up everyone, not just a select few. As the campaign progressed, I grew accustomed to the rhythm of this new life. I learned to navigate the crowds, the cameras, the constant scrutiny. But there were days when the pace felt relentless, when the weight of our public life seemed to press down on me. I worried about the toll it was taking on Malia and Sasha, on Barack, on myself. And yet, each time I felt the strain, I'd remind myself why we were doing this, why we had chosen to walk this path. It was for something larger than ourselves, a commitment to a vision that went beyond personal ambition. This was about hope, about possibility, about the belief that we could create a better world for our daughters and for generations to come. As Barack's campaign gained traction, the attention we received only intensified. The media dissected every aspect of our lives, from our family background to our personal choices. Commentators would weigh in on my words, my clothes, my demeanor, sometimes turning the most trivial details into headlines. It was a strange experience, feeling so exposed, so visible, and I had to work hard to keep my sense of self intact. I reminded myself that these opinions didn't define me, that I knew who I was, what I believed in, and what mattered most. But there were moments when the criticism stung, when it felt like an invasion of the life I had worked so hard to build. One night, after a long day of rallies and meetings, I sat down with Barack for a rare, quiet moment. We'd managed to sync our schedules, and he was home in Chicago, if only for a few hours. We talked about the campaign, about the challenges we were facing, and about the people who had shared their stories with us. He listened to my worries, to my hopes, and in his usual calm way, he reassured me that we were in this together, that our commitment to each other and to our family was the foundation of everything we were doing. Those moments of connection were rare, but they were also what kept us going, a reminder that beneath the demands of public life, we were still the same two people who had embarked on this journey together. In the weeks leading up to the election, the energy around us grew even more intense. The crowds at rallies swelled, the media attention doubled, and the pressure to perform, to convince, to inspire, felt immense. I'd look out at the faces of the people who had come to hear us, and I could feel their hope, their belief that we were fighting for something important. It was both humbling and daunting, knowing that so many people were counting on us, that they saw in us the possibility of change. And yet, amidst the excitement, I felt a calmness, a sense that no matter what happened, we had done everything we could, that we had given this journey our all. Election night arrived with a sense of anticipation that was both thrilling and overwhelming. We gathered with close friends, family, and campaign staff, all of us holding our breath as the results began to come in. There was a nervous energy in the room, a mix of hope and anxiety as we waited for the numbers to unfold. I held Malia and Sasha close, watching the screen as states turned blue or red, each one bringing us closer to the answer that would shape our future. And when the announcement finally came, when it became clear that Barack had won, the room erupted in cheers, the joy and relief almost palpable. In that moment, surrounded by the people who had believed in us, who had worked tirelessly by our side, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. We had done it. We had reached a milestone that felt both surreal and deeply earned. But even as we celebrated, I knew that this was only the beginning, that the real work lay ahead. We had stepped into a new reality, one that would require even more resilience, more commitment, and more faith in each other. The months that followed were filled with preparation, with the whirlwind of transition, as we prepared to step into a life that was both exciting and daunting. I knew that our family would face challenges, that we would have to adapt, to find new ways to stay grounded. But I also knew that we were ready, that together we could face whatever lay ahead. And as I looked at Barack, at our daughters, at the friends and family who had been with us through every step of this journey, I felt a sense of peace. We were on a path that was greater than ourselves, a journey that would test us, shape us, and ultimately make us stronger. And in that knowledge, I found the strength to keep moving forward, to embrace this new chapter, and to continue becoming more. As Barack's campaign advanced, each day felt like another step deeper into uncharted territory. The general election was drawing near, and the intensity surrounding us grew with every passing day. The once familiar routines that had grounded our family now seemed a world away as our lives transformed into a constant movement of rallies, interviews, debates, and relentless travel. My role had evolved as well. I was no longer just a supportive spouse, but had become an active figure in the campaign. People were interested in my story, my background, and my perspective, and I was increasingly asked to speak on Barack's behalf, to share my own journey, and to connect with people in a way that felt both personal and genuine. The campaign trail was grueling. Every state, every city had its own set of challenges and opportunities. Barack's team had mapped out a rigorous schedule, crisscrossing the country to reach voters who were eager to hear his vision for America. He'd wake up early for morning events, move to meet and greets and press conferences throughout the day, and end with town halls and speeches at night. It was nonstop, and I could see how much it was taking out of him. I worried about his health, his energy, and his ability to stay grounded amid the whirlwind. He'd return to the hotel at the end of each day, exhausted yet still driven, still talking about the people he'd met, the stories they'd shared, and the issues that fueled his passion. Our daughters, Malia and Sasha, were young enough to still be shielded from the full intensity of the campaign. But I knew they could sense the changes around them. They missed their father, missed the routines and stability we'd once had, and I felt a deep responsibility to keep their lives as normal as possible. I'd create pockets of routine in the midst of the chaos, breakfast together in the mornings, bedtime stories at night, little moments that made them feel safe and connected. But it was a challenge, balancing the public demands with the private needs of our family, and there were days when I wondered how long we could keep it up. As I took on a larger role in the campaign, I found my own voice evolving. At first, speaking to crowds had felt intimidating, a task I approached with caution. But as I shared my story, the story of growing up on the south side of Chicago, of navigating spaces that often felt unwelcoming, of striving to make a difference in my community, I began to feel a connection with the people who came to hear me speak. They saw themselves in my story, in my journey, and that connection gave me strength. I realized that this campaign wasn't just about Barack's vision. It was about our shared experiences, our shared hopes, and our collective desire for a better future. The scrutiny we faced was intense. Every word, every gesture was dissected, analyzed, and sometimes distorted by the media. Headlines questioned my intentions, criticized my choices, and painted a picture of our family that often felt unrecognizable. I struggled with the constant invasion of our privacy, the feeling that our lives were no longer our own. It was exhausting, and there were moments when I felt the weight of it pressing down on me, moments when I questioned whether it was all worth it. But each time I felt that doubt, I'd think about the people we were fighting for, the families who needed health care, the students who needed better schools, the workers who needed fair wages. Their stories reminded me of the purpose behind the sacrifice, and it gave me the resolve to keep going. The public events and rallies were exhilarating, a chance to connect with people who believed in the vision Barack had laid out. There were nights when we'd stand together on a stage, looking out at a sea of faces filled with hope and anticipation. I'd feel the energy of the crowd, the sense of unity that transcended race, background, and political affiliation. Those moments were powerful, a reminder of the possibility of change, the belief that together we could build a better future. But for every moment of exhilaration, there were quiet moments of exhaustion, times when I'd retreat to a hotel room and feel the weight of it all, the endless travel, the speeches, the constant presence of cameras and reporters. I leaned on family and close friends to stay grounded. My mother, who had always been my rock, continued to support me, reminding me of the values that had shaped me, of the strength that came from staying true to myself. She'd come to watch Malia and Sasha when I was on the road, creating a sense of stability for them in the midst of the campaign. Her presence was a reminder that no matter how far we went, home was always within reach, that the roots we had planted were strong enough to withstand the storms. Barack and I would catch brief moments together amid the chaos, finding time to talk, to laugh, to remind each other the life we had built and the future we were working toward. In those moments, I'd see the same man I'd fallen in love with, the man driven by a sense of purpose, by a commitment to serve others, by a belief in the potential for change. His eyes would light up as he talked about the issues he was passionate about, the people he was fighting for, and I felt a renewed sense of pride and admiration. It was in those quiet conversations that I found the strength to keep going, to believe that this journey, as difficult as it was worth it. As Election Day approached, the intensity reached new heights. The stakes felt higher, the expectations greater, and the pressure nearly overwhelming. We were on the cusp of something monumental, a possibility that held both promise and uncertainty. The days were a blur of events, speeches, and strategy meetings, each one a step closer to the finish line. I could feel the tension building, not just within our team, but in the country as a whole. People were waiting, watching, hoping for change, and we carried the weight of those hopes with us every day. On election night, we gathered with friends, family, and supporters, all of us holding our breath as the results started to come in. The room was filled with a mix of excitement, anxiety, and anticipation, each of us aware that this was a moment that could change our lives forever. When the final results were announced, the room erupted in cheers, the energy almost overwhelming. Barack had won, and in that moment, I felt a surge of pride, relief, and gratitude. We had achieved something remarkable, something that had once seemed impossible. But amid the celebration, I felt a quiet sense of resolve. I knew that this was only the beginning, that the work was just starting. Becoming the first family would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and a level of scrutiny unlike anything we'd ever experienced. I looked at Malia and Sasha, their faces bright with joy, and I knew that our lives were about to change in ways they couldn't yet understand. But I also knew that we were ready, that we had the strength, the resilience, and the commitment to face whatever lay ahead. In the quiet moments after the victory, Barack and I sat together, reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. We talked about the challenges we'd faced, the sacrifices we'd made, and the people who had supported us along the way. And as we looked ahead, I felt a sense of calm, a certainty that we were on the right path. We were stepping into a new chapter, one that would demand more from us than ever before, but we were ready. Together, we would continue to become more, not just for ourselves, but for our family, our community, and the country we had committed to serve.
In the years since leaving the White House, life has settled into a quieter rhythm, though it remains rich with purpose and intention. There is a unique transition that comes with moving from the glare of global attention back into a semblance of normalcy. For Barack and me, this shift has been both a relief and an adjustment. We had been on a journey that shaped not only our own lives, but the lives of countless people. And as we moved into this new chapter, we carried with us the lessons, the memories, and a sense of responsibility to continue the work we started. Our first steps away from the White House were marked by an intentional focus on family. Malia and Sasha, now young women, had their own paths to explore, their own dreams to chase. The years they had spent growing up under the public, I had given them a strength, a resilience that I both marveled at and felt deeply protective of. Moving into a private life was as much a gift for them as it was for us. It allowed them to shed the expectations of being first daughters and instead embrace the freedom to be simply themselves. For Barack, the post-presidency years meant finding a way to continue contributing, though now without the title or formal office. His time in the Oval Office had been filled with immense challenges and hard-won victories, and I could see that he was carrying the weight of those experiences. Yet, true to his nature, he approached this new chapter with a sense of curiosity and optimism, seeing it as an opportunity to expand the work we had started. He began writing, speaking, and engaging with people across the country and around the world, sharing his reflections and insights in ways that felt deeply personal and authentic. It was a reminder that leadership doesn't end with a title. It's a mindset, a commitment to service that transcends position or power. My own journey post-White House has been one of discovery and reconnection. In many ways, stepping out of the spotlight has allowed me to return to the passions and pursuits that had always been a part of me but had been set aside during our time in office. I threw myself into writing my memoir, Becoming, as a way of reflecting on my life, of telling my story in my own words. It was a cathartic process, an opportunity to process the journey, to confront the challenges and celebrate the victories. Sharing my story was a way of reconnecting with people, of showing them that behind the titles and the roles, there was a person who had walked a path not so different from theirs. In these quieter years, our focus has also turned toward the Obama Foundation, an organization rooted in the values and principles that have guided us from the beginning. The foundation is more than just a continuation of our work. It is an opportunity to empower the next generation of leaders, to give young people the tools and resources they need to make a difference in their own communities. We have always believed in the power of individuals to drive change, and the foundation is our way of nurturing that potential, of planting seeds that will grow into movements, into progress that extends far beyond our own lifetimes. One of the most rewarding aspects of this work has been the chance to travel, to meet with young leaders around the world, each of them driven by a vision of a better future. In their stories, I see echoes of my own journey, the hopes and dreams that propelled me forward, even when the path was uncertain. It is a privilege to witness their growth, to see them take up the mantle of leadership, each one carrying forward the legacy of resilience and service. And in these young leaders, I find hope, a reminder that the work of building a just and equitable world is a continuous journey, one that each generation must carry forward. As I reflect on the journey that has brought me to this moment, I am filled with gratitude for the people who have supported us, for the challenges that have shaped us, and for the opportunity to have served in ways both big and small. My life has been a series of steps, each one a choice to keep moving forward, to keep striving to become more. And though the journey has been far from easy, it has been profoundly meaningful, a testament to the power of resilience, love, and purpose. In these quieter years, I have come to appreciate the beauty of simplicity, the joy of small moments spent with family and friends. Barack and I have settled into a life that is rich with the things that matter most, time with loved ones, meaningful work, and the chance to continue learning and growing. Our journey is far from over. We continue to explore, to push ourselves, to find new ways to make an impact. But there is a sense of peace that comes with knowing that we have done our part, that we have given everything we have to the path we chose. And as I look to the future, I am filled with a quiet optimism. The world is complex, filled with both challenges and possibilities, but I believe in the power of individuals to make a difference. I believe in the resilience of communities, the strength of voices that refuse to be silenced, and the potential for change that lies within each of us. This journey of becoming is not just mine. It belongs to everyone who has ever dared to dream, to strive, to reach beyond what they thought was possible. In the end, becoming is about growth, about embracing the journey, about understanding that we are always in the process of becoming more fully ourselves. It is a reminder that life is not about arriving at a destination, but about finding meaning in the steps we take, in the choices we make, and in the impact we have on others. And as I continue on this path, I do so with a sense of purpose, a commitment to continue becoming, to continue learning, and to continue serving, knowing that each step is part of a journey that is as beautiful as it is unfinished. Acknowledgements as I reach the end of this book, I'm filled with gratitude, recognizing that my journey has been far from a solo endeavor. Every step, every challenge, every moment of joy has been woven with the presence and love of people who stood by me, lifted me, and shaped me. Writing this book has allowed me to reflect on these relationships and remember the immense support that has been my foundation. It's to these people, my family, friends, mentors, and community, that I owe so much of who I am today. First and foremost, my mother, Marian Robinson, who was my first teacher and my fiercest protector. Her quiet strength, her unflinching loyalty to our family, and the sacrifices she made to give Craig and me a strong start in life have been the grounding force of my life. She taught me about resilience, about moving forward even when the path isn't clear, and about finding pride in one's roots. Through her example, I learned what it means to lead with dignity and grace. She has been there at every major turn, steady and unfazed, reminding me of who I am and where I come from. I owe her more than words can express. To my father, Fraser Robinson, who taught me the value of hard work and commitment. Though he's no longer here, his lessons live on in every aspect of my life. My father worked through pain, through long hours, all to give us a better life. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. I feel his presence in every decision I make, in every step I take towards something greater. Dad, this journey has been as much for you as it has been for me. Thank you for being my hero, my constant inspiration, and for showing me what strength looks like. My brother, Craig, my first friend, my lifelong protector, and the one who knows me better than anyone else. Growing up together, we shared not only a roof but also dreams, jokes, and the unspoken bond that only siblings can understand. Craig, you've always been there to ground me, to remind me of who I am, especially when life got complicated. You've been my champion and my reality check, and I am so grateful to have walked this path with you by my side. To my husband, Barack, my partner in every sense of the word. Ours has been a journey marked by love, laughter, challenges, and dreams that felt too big at times. Barack, thank you for sharing your life with me, for believing in us, and for standing by me as I became the woman I was meant to be. You've taught me to think bigger, to see beyond myself, and to always keep hope alive, even when the world seems heavy. Our journey has been an incredible one, and I wouldn't have wanted to walk it with anyone else. My daughters, Malia and Sasha, who have been my greatest teachers in patience, humility, and love. Being your mother has been my deepest joy, my most precious role. Thank you for sharing your lives with me, for allowing me to be imperfect, and for showing me what true resilience looks like. You've shown me the world through fresh eyes, reminded me to laugh at myself, and given me strength in ways you may not even realize. I am so proud of the women you are becoming. To the community that raised me, the South Side of Chicago. Growing up in a place filled with hardworking families, community leaders, teachers, and friends who cared for each other, who looked out for one another, shaped my sense of purpose. South Side, you taught me that strength lies in unity, that each of us has the potential to rise, and that our backgrounds are something to celebrate, not overcome. To my teachers, mentors, and friends, thank you for encouraging me to reach for more, for believing in me when I sometimes doubted myself. I must also acknowledge the many friends, colleagues, and mentors who became part of my journey along the way. Thank you to each of you who believed in me, who offered guidance and laughter, who challenged me to grow and held me accountable. To my friends who were there before all the titles, before the spotlight, thank you for reminding me of the joy of simplicity, for keeping me grounded and real. You've been my chosen family, my support system, and I'm forever grateful for your love and loyalty. Finally, to every reader of this book, to everyone who has found something familiar in my story, I thank you. This journey, these experiences, they're not just mine, they belong to all of us. Thank you for allowing me to share my life with you, for listening, for seeing me, and for joining me in this journey of becoming.